replicate the original study. He was spearheading a mammoth effort to reproduce dozens of studies in psychology. Along with a panel of reviewers, he selected this study for replication and asked Carolyn Gibson at Georgia Southern University to conduct it. Brian wanted the replication to closely match the conditions of the original study. If you don't do that, you really are conducting two different studies. After launching the replication, he had second thoughts about its location.
To do a replication simultaneously at UC Berkeley and the West Coast University, where Asians are much more prominent members of the community.
The team in Berkeley was headed by Alice Moon. Alice was a fan of the original paper.
When I heard about it, I just thought it was like one of the very cool demonstrations in social psychology, and so that's why I always liked this paper.
She followed the protocol of the original Harvard experiment. She recruited Asian women, reminded them of the female side of their identity or the Asian side of their identity, and then gave them a map.
Participants who were in the Asian identity salient condition with the participants in the female identity salient condition, we found that there was no difference in their math performance.
The celebrated study failed to be replicated. When Brian Nosek announced the finding about this and dozens of other studies that could not be replicated, it caused an uproar.
Psychology did not hold up.
Newspaper articles called it a crisis. Critics hurled accusations about fraud and scientific misconduct.
Running into some problems.
In a 6,000-word cover story, the conservative magazine Weekly Standard said that liberals had been making up research into how stereotypes affect women and people of color. The Berkeley study, however, was not the only replication of Todd Patinsky and Margaret Shee's paper. Remember how Brian had two groups conduct replications? I asked Carolyn Gibson at Georgia Southern University what she found when she ran the experiment on Asian women and math.
When primed with Asian identity, Asian females did better on a math test compared to those who had been primed with their female identity, and then those primed with their female identity did significantly worse.
Carolyn has no doubt about the meaning of what she found.
I believe that it further supports the original finding and that it gives even more robust evidence to this idea, mostly because we followed the same method as the original study and because we collected more participants, and so we have a more powerful study.
At Berkeley, Alice isn't sure.
I do believe that stereotypes in general do have effects on our lives, but in terms of this particular finding about whether stereotypes can facilitate people's academic performance, I guess it has made me question whether or not that finding is true.
Okay, so which is it? Should we trust the results of the Berkeley study and say that Todd Patinsky and Margaret Shee's finding was disproved? Should we trust the Georgia study and say the finding was confirmed? What happens when scientific studies disagree with one another? The popular narrative of the replication crisis suggests that scientists are like dueling gladiators. If two scientists come up with different findings, it must mean one of them is wrong, or worse, one of them must have faked her data. When we come back, we look at why this idea misunderstands how science actually works.
Our statistical techniques are probabilistic and not definitive, and so we absolutely need replications. But replications in our current academic climate are also serving the purpose of trying to vet out academic fraud and are serving as a detection technique. And those two are very different missions for replications.
Stay with us.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from the all-new Toyota Prius. Thanks to a new double wishbone rear suspension and a lower center of gravity, the 2016 Prius makes any getaway more thrilling. And with modern, striking lines and standard bi-LED headlights, it has an edge at every angle. With sleek styling and a surprisingly exhilarating ride, the 2016 Prius is anything but expected. The all-new 2016 Toyota Prius. It's what's next. Support also comes from Weebly. You don't have to be a web designer or know code to create a fantastic website with Weebly. Created for people with the courage to start their own business and the dream to be their own boss. Choose from professionally designed mobile-friendly themes. Then just drag and drop to quickly build and publish your site. update your site on any device. Get started for free at weebly.com/brain. weebly.com/brain.
This is Hidden Brain. I'm Shankar Vedanta. We're taking a look today at how science works and the so-called replication crisis in the social sciences. As I listened to the news reports, I found myself drawing an analogy with my own profession, journalism. Here's what I mean. A few years ago, a reporter for the New York Times was caught fabricating stories. Instead of traveling to various locations and interviewing people, he simply made stuff up. The newspaper went back and re-reported the stories Jason Blair had written. When the facts didn't match, the reporter was fired. Imagine for a second what would happen if we re-reported every story by every reporter at the New York Times. Even when reporters are doing a perfectly good job, the older news stories might not match. A source might not say exactly the same thing again. Sometimes, if the circumstances have changed, a source might say something completely different. So when two reporters don't produce the same story, it could be that one of them is making stuff up. But much more likely is that both of them are right. Now, I know what you're thinking. Journalism is storytelling, science is about data. But let's look closely at what happened in the replications that Carolyn Gibson and Alice Moon did of Todd Petinsky's study. In the original study, women administered the experiment. In Georgia, the facilitator was also female. But in Berkeley, where the replication failed, both male and female facilitators administered the study. Could that have made a difference?
Let's be clear. So it was not an exact replication. So here's an example. It mentions clearly in the paper that, and I don't know whether this factor is important or not, that in one study, the experimenter gender were males. In another study, the experimenter gender were females. I have no idea whether that's a factor that could explain the difference between the two studies. And so let's be clear about what, it's not an exact replication.
This is Eric Bradlow from the University of Pennsylvania. He's eminently qualified to talk about this stuff.
Spent 4 years here at Wharton studying statistics and mathematics. Went on to get my PhD in statistics, and for the last 20 years I've been applying statistical methods to lots of problems, but I consider myself a mathematical social scientist.
Eric believes that requiring studies to achieve statistical replication, to match more or less perfectly, before you conclude that either is true, is like requiring two reporters to cover a basketball game and come back with nearly identical stories.
Exact replication is one of those mythological ivory tower things that doesn't exist. What we really need to think about is, if the study doesn't replicate, why doesn't it replicate? And even if it doesn't replicate exactly, it may actually reinforce the original finding. In other words, you may be more certain.
This isn't just true about studies in psychology. Eric told me that NIH researchers once found that lab mice, given a sedative, took 35 minutes to recover. When the experiment was repeated, the mice took 16 minutes to recover. The scientists scratched their heads. It made no sense. It took a while to figure out that something that shouldn't have made a difference did. In between the two experiments, wood shavings in the animal cages were changed. Turns out that red cedar and pine shavings step up the speed at which the sedative was metabolized. Birch or maple don't. This is not to say that repeating experiments is useless or pointless. It's incredibly valuable. But replications primarily help us understand the nuances around a phenomenon. They're not very useful as a tool to detect fraud.
Just because you get different results doesn't mean you shouldn't trust them. How much are they within a margin of error of each other? Are there other variables that would make it so that study done at University A and the study done at University B wouldn't yield exactly the same thing? I think that's a better way of looking at it than say, if you don't get exactly the same results, or even results that are very nearly the same, you can't trust them. I think that's a superficial level of science. I think you need to go below that.
So when you yourself look at a study that has not replicated, or you look at what's sometimes called a failed replication, do you not at the back of your mind say, well, this disproves the first study? Do you actually never think that way?
Never is a long word. Never's a strong word. You know, I have to think of that James Bond movie when Sean Connery said, "I will never do James Bond again," and then 15 years later, he came out with a movie called Never Say Never Again. No, I would never say that, but I would say the following. Let's imagine that you do a study and that you find that, people that take an SAT prep course do 15% better on the SAT. And let's imagine that someone else does a study and the answer is only 3%. Now, there's two possibilities. One is the first study, for whatever reason, overestimated the effect. That's entirely possible. And therefore 3% is less than 15%. But note, if you combine those two studies together, your finding might actually be stronger in the sense I'm now more sure that SAT prep helps performance on the SAT. Now, the effect size may shrink from 15% to 11%, but also notice I've possibly now doubled or tripled my sample size, so my uncertainty goes down, and now I may even be more sure that SAT prep helps. Maybe not to the degree that it helped in the first study, but still I'm more sure that it's actually effective.
When you think about different branches of science, though, aren't there branches of science where you can expect the same thing to happen very predictably over and over again? When you look at particle physics, for example, you would expect that if you fire 20,000 protons out of a gun, that they're basically going to do the same thing pretty much every time.
Well, it's been you're testing the boundary of my memory of my particle physics class when I took it here at Penn. But my understanding is, of course, and this is what statisticians study, right? We study the concept of randomness. And so every science, every discipline, unless you're talking about an equal sign, like E equals MC squared. E doesn't approximately equal MC squared, it actually equals. Most physical laws and things aren't equal signs, there's approximate signs, and so that means there's randomness to it. I think if you fire 20,000 protons, you would see that there's a deviation in the way they collide with other particles, and there's randomness. I think the same thing is true in the social sciences. You bring in 500 subjects, you bring them in at University A, you bring them in at University B, there's randomness in people's answers. Of course, you would hope the overall patterns would be similar, but the fact is this belief that you're going to get exactly the same findings, I'm not sure that's something science should be striving for.
Any individual study is just that, an individual study. It isn't the truth.
Every observation is a point, it's a dot. And we observe dots, and then we observe more dots. And if those dots replicate, great, then we have more belief. Science is about the evolution of knowledge, right?
But the process is never ending. There will always be more things to uncover, more nuances.
We get more certain about what it is we know, and we also get more certain about what are called boundary conditions or moderators. Like, for example, maybe this effect holds in urban areas versus not. Maybe it holds in California and not in Alabama. Maybe it holds for people that hold these stereotypes, and maybe it doesn't hold for people that don't. To me, that's an advance of science. We have found what's called a main effect, which is, stereotypes have an effect on outcomes, or priming has an effect on outcomes, and then we say, oh, and by the way, it doesn't hold in these conditions. That's not a failure to replicate. That's a more nuanced view of the original finding.
At Harvard, Dan Gilbert says you can expect some studies to replicate nearly perfectly every time, but in other cases, the very thing you're studying is changing, so exact replications aren't possible.
There are many findings in psychological science that we would expect to replicate quite exactly. Years later, eye blink conditioning is a very nice example. If I blow in your eye enough, you're going to start blinking as I purse my lips. It's not going to be very different across cultures, across times, across age groups. Other kinds of findings certainly are. There's one of my favorite experiments in social psychology shows that when young men who are from the north or the south of the United States are insulted, they react very differently, because northerners and southerners have very different codes of honor. Now, you can't take that experiment and expect to do it in Italy, or expect to do it 25 years from now. It's an experiment that's of its moment and of its time.
Every researcher I spoke with told me there's lots of agreement within the scientific community. There are certainly many scientific studies that are poorly designed. There are researchers who do shoddy work. There is great pressure at universities and scientific journals to publish striking findings. But the solution to all these problems, say Eric Bradlow, Brian Nosek, and Dan Gilbert, is more and better science. Eric Bradham.
The truth will come out. More dots will come out. And if it turns out that what I published, it's not because I did anything fraudulent, just isn't true because of sample size, the way I collected the data, then you know what? Science will eventually figure out that what I'm saying is not true. So if you like it.
Brian Nosek is bemused that his findings about replicability have been taken to mean that the studies that fail to reproduce are worthless. He started a new system where researchers register protocols for their studies and commit to sticking to them. Scientific journals commit to publishing the findings of these studies, regardless of whether the results are sexy.
Science is the slow march of accumulating evidence, and it's very easy to want a simple answer. Is it true? Is it false? But really, replication is just an opportunity to accumulate more evidence to get a more precise estimate of that particular effect.
To most people, the debate over scientific truth is an abstract issue. Most of us turn to scientists for answers. Should I drink a glass of red wine in the evening? Is this drug safe to give to my ailing mother? Should I give my kid $1 every time she does something while at school? In reality, science is more in the question business than the answer business. There's a reason nearly every scientific paper ends with a call for more research. Especially when it comes to human behavior, nearly every conclusion you can draw about human beings has tons of exceptions. Are people selfish? Yeah, except millions act altruistically every day. Are humans kind? Yes, except that few species are capable of greater cruelty. If you want answers that never change, definitive conclusions and final truths, odds are you don't want to ask a scientist. The Hidden Brain podcast is produced by Cara McGurk-Allison, Maggie Penman, and Max Nestrak. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and follow my stories on your local public radio station. If you like this episode, consider giving us a review on iTunes. It will help other people find the podcast. I'm Shankar Vedantam, and this is NPR. Thanks for listening to Hidden Brain. If you haven't already, please try the NPR One app for your phone. You can hear Guy Raz's interview with TED curator Chris Anderson, where they discuss the art of public speaking. You can search for shows, find stories from your local station, and listen to great podcasts. NPR One is in the App Store now. Also, Invisibilia Season 2 returns on June 17th. This season, the show goes to a prison, an oil rig, McDonald's in Russia, and a beach in New Jersey to explore the worlds of work, family, and government. Catch up on Season 1 anytime and listen to the Season 2 preview at npr.org/podcasts and on the NPR One app.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from TIAA. Whether it's investing, advice, banking, or retirement, TIAA believes smart financial decisions should enable life, not define it. TIAA calls this the new success story. Learn more at TIAA.org.
This is Hidden Brain. I'm Shankar Vedantam. Millions of us try to lose weight every year. We go on diets, read books, buy pills off the internet. Collectively,
all those workouts, challenges, and temptations head down.
With thousands of diets out there, they've all chosen.
Jack was trying to teach me sugar equals pain. Yes, I was miserable.
as they say in the infomercials, there must be a better way. This week, we're going to talk about psychological tricks we can play on ourselves to help us eat better and to follow through on our best intentions.
My name is Adam Brumberg. I am the Deputy Director of the Cornell Food and Brand Lab at Cornell University.
Adam Brumberg and his colleagues research food psychology, and they find that many of our food choices aren't really conscious choices.
The majority of your food decisions are based on habit or convenience. You know, habit being, I did it yesterday, worked out fine, I'm going to do it again. And convenience, well, I'm sitting at my desk and there is a package of green on the desk. I eat that instead of going to find something that's healthier.
Once you understand these bad unconscious patterns, you can stay on willpower to fight them. But there's also a smarter way. You could turn the tables and get these unconscious habits to work for you.
Yeah, I mean, we like to say that the best diet is the one you don't know you're on. Our research shows you make about 200 food-related decisions a day, which is a lot.
By food decisions, Adam doesn't just mean whether you eat a salad or a sandwich. It's also how much salt do you put on your food? Do you have a slice of cake when your coworker celebrates a birthday? Do you reward yourself for going to the gym with a cookie? Here's one example of how you can turn the tables on your unconscious habits. Adam and his colleagues find that volunteers in lab experiments make worse choices when they're stressed.
Stressed out folks are more likely to buy a good or select fried items as opposed to the people who have to think of things they were grateful for. They were more likely to get salad or grilled chicken or whatever it was.
Once you understand how stress shapes mindless eating, you can set up a system when you're not stressed that allows you to take advantage of this tendency.
If you pack a lunch the night before, you're definitely going to put together something that's a lot more helpful than if you are doing it as you're running out of the house in the morning.
Now, Adam Brumberg says, when you're stressed out at work and mindlessly reaching for something to eat, your hand's going to come up with a carrot rather than a ring.
You have to work really hard to eat too many baby carrots.
We decided to devote this whole episode to ideas like this. Coming up in a moment, senior Stopwatch Science correspondent Dan Pink and I are going to trade psychological tricks that might help your actual waistline look like the one you want.
Behavioral science has given us lots of tricks for eating less. Plates, portions, but a new study this year in the Journal of the Association of Consumer Research offers another option.
And also the tunnels are 2 lanes, and this is a 3-lane
So
highway,
pull up a
which
chair
is
at
kind
a
of,
big
I
table
don't know, at some
and
point
stay
they'll
with
probably
us.
have to fix the tunnels.
research showing that we make better decisions for our future selves. And so I'm going to tell you right now, Dan, I'm going to stick to my next 60-second deadline on my next Stop What Science Says.
Okay, well, I'm going to set the timer, and it's going off right now.
Right, this is a study that makes me very happy. If you're on a diet, should you allow yourself to cheat? The rational answer is no. The hidden brain answer is yes. A study in the Journal of Consumer Psychology finds that when dieters are told they can have a day off each week from their diets, where they can eat whatever they want, this is a day of planned cheating. They did just as well when it came to losing weight as dieters who didn't give themselves any room to cheat. Even better, the dieters who cheated reported being happier with their diets and maybe would stick to them much longer. The researchers have a wonderful academic euphemism to describe this kind of cheating. They call these hedonic deviations.
Nice.
The important thing to remember here is that the cheating has to be planned and deliberate. Most diets end with a crash. When you crash, you feel like you failed. When you plan your hedonic deviations, it's not a crash. It's just a controlled landing before you take off again. It puts you in charge, makes you happier, might have long-term health benefits.
Yeah, that's quite fascinating. I actually think that some of it also has to do with autonomy. That when you're on a diet, you're very controlled. So if you have this escape valve where you're in control just for one day, that can probably make you feel better and probably boost adherence. I also love the idea of the hedonic deviation. I think that I like to consider Stopwatch Science a hedonic deviation in the lives of American listeners.
I'll tell you what, I think I'm going to stick to my time better the next time, Dan. If occasionally, maybe once every 2 weeks, you give me 2 minutes to do a Stopwatch Science.
We can have a cheat day for Stopwatch Science.
Alright, so there you have it. Buy a big table and cut your food into tiny pieces. Be mindful of your eating companions, or as Dan would put it, eat with men, not women. Eat a big breakfast, not a big dinner. Tell kids vegetables are tasty and not very healthy. Have a rule of thumb when you go to a restaurant. 1 drink, 1 entree. And if you're going on a diet, plan on indulging yourself once in a while. Dan, thank you for joining me on Stop What Science.
Always a pleasure.
The Hidden Brain podcast is produced by Clara McGrath-Allison, Maggie Penman, and Max Nestra. Find more Hidden Brain on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and hear my stories on your local public radio station. I'm Shankar Vedanti, and this is NPR. Thanks for listening to Hidden Brain. You should try out the new NPR One app for your phone for conversations you won't hear anywhere else. This week, Guy Raz interviews TED curator Chris Anderson, where they discuss the secrets to giving a great TED Talk. Search for TED Radio on the NPR One app, where you can also find stories from your local station and more great podcasts. NPR One is in the App Store now. In defending employees from unfair practices in the workplace. So, Matthew thinks a lot about employees. What makes them unhappy? What makes them tick?
We're in contact with each other for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And so it's real helpful if people are happy with each other.
And he asked himself how he could make his employees happy. Matthew's firm gives out holiday bonuses at the end of the year,
and it's not reflective specifically on their performance.
Matthew decided to tinker with the system. In addition to the bonuses at the end of the year, what if people got bonuses throughout the year? They would be smaller, of course, but would provide a steady stream of appreciation. Matthew also put in place a second idea, a radical idea. What if, instead of having a manager decide who got the bonuses, employees awarded bonuses directly to one another?
The peer bonus system was a system that, as we put it in place, allows any of the people in the office to give a cash bonus to any of the other people in the office.
Matthew figured that if anyone knew about a worker's accomplishments, or how hard an employee was working on a project, it would be her co-workers.
The fact that Leonie got acknowledged for when she passed her notary certificate program and got her notary license, although I knew it happened, I probably wouldn't have thought about it for a specific bonus. And I know that Maria had received one for working on a particular project from another person who was on the project. And although I know that they were both working on the project, I didn't realize how much work Maria had done.
The bonuses were only $100 apiece, but Maria Garcia, the legal assistant in the office, says she likes getting a pat on the back from a colleague.
I love the recognition. I love not so much what the dollar amount is, but heck, getting the bonus, that means I take my family to dinner.
The idea for this bonus program came from another workplace, one of the most famous workplaces in the world, Google.
People innovate more, they stick around at the company longer, they seem happier, and honestly, the happiness by itself is enough of a result. That's kind of the right thing to do and the right way to treat people.
This is Laszlo Bach, head of Google's people operations. That's Google speak for Human Resources Department.
Yours not to discover.
Matthew got the idea for the peer bonus system from Laszlo's book, Workrooms, which is all about how organizations can find and keep talented people.
It starts with a presumption or an assumption that people are fundamentally good and that people will kind of do better stuff if they feel like it's theirs.
Today, we're going to take a deep dive into these ideas with Laszlo Bach, who joins me now. Laszlo, welcome to Hidden Brain.
Oh, it's fantastic to be here. I'm a huge fan of the show. Thank you.
You've looked at a lot of companies outside of Google and down history that have in many ways invented the template for what you do at Google. So in your book you mentioned Bell Labs and Henry Ford, a number of other examples. What do these companies do vis-a-vis their employees that caught your eye?
Well, there's a few things, and I'd actually add even the U.S. military to the list. One thing is, if you take a look at Bell Labs, for example, the way they thought about how time was spent and how space was arrayed and how people interacted was amazing and inspiring. So when they built the buildings that Bell Labs were in, they set up the buildings where there's a long corridor down this long building and all the offices were off to the sides. And the thesis was people would kind of stumble out of their offices and bump into each other and had interesting conversations. There's a direct line from that to the way, for example, at Google, we run our cafes, where we have these round tables and long tables where you end up sitting next to strangers and bumping into them. And we try to manufacture these moments of serendipity in much the way Bell Labs did. If you look at the U.S. Army, for example, they've been doing all kinds
employees to think of themselves not as employees, but almost as founders, as owners of the enterprise. Walk me through how you try and find ways to get employees at Google to feel like they are founders and owners as opposed to employees.
Middle of Pennsylvania,
well, there's a few things.
Looks like
it starts with a presumption or an assumption that people are fundamentally good, and that people will kind of do better stuff if they feel like it's theirs. Just the same way that people take better care of their personal car than a rental car. So there's a number of things we do at the company to try to instill that. One is we literally make everyone owners. When you join Google, no matter what the job, no matter where in the world, everyone gets stock. And at our size, it's actually pretty unusual. Most companies at our size stop giving stock to everybody. We think it's important. The second thing is being transparent with people about what happens in the company's life. So we have a weekly all hands that our CEO Sundar Pichai hosts with Larry and Sergey, our founders, where you can ask any question, you get updates on what's happening in the company. Tremendous amounts of information are shared. Everyone's goals in the company are visible to everybody else. And the idea is, again, if it's your thing, you should know what's going on with it. And then finally, we have a lot of vehicles where people can exert their freedom, feel ownership for things. We give them a lot of channels to express voice, whether it's through the particular ways we kind of do surveys or ask people for input, but also by encouraging people to feel like the company is less hierarchical. We have 62,000 employees, and the company's gonna feel like a large organization, and people are going to come in being sensitive to, well, if somebody has a fancy title or if they're the founder, I should be careful and probably not reach out to them. And instead we encourage them and say, look, if something's going wrong, drop a note to Larry, drop a note to Sundar, reach out to anybody, because where you sit in the hierarchy doesn't matter. It's all of our thing. It's all of our organization, and we all have an obligation to make it better.
Because, of course, this is what happens in many organizations. People on the front line see things that actually are not working as well as they should, or see things that could be made better. They're on the front lines, and they actually have insights into how to make them better, but they often feel stymied or frustrated or impotent to actually send those signals to others in the organization and actually see change happen.
You're absolutely right. I mean, it's kind of a truism in business that the people who actually know what's going on are the ones who are touching your users, touching your customers, touching your advertisers. They see truth. And the bigger you are, the harder it is for that to get filtered up through the organization. But you want those people to just fix it. So, for example, we have a team that works with our small and medium customers, our advertisers. So these are mom and pop shops, florists and bakers and boot makers and whatnot. And a young woman working on one of these teams was helping a customer figure out how to do their advertising.
Signage changes over Laurel Highlands.
And finished the call by saying, is there anything else I can do for you? And this small business owner said, well, I'm kind of hungry. It's lunchtime. Can you order me a pizza? That's right. Good question. I mean, she asked. So she ordered him a pizza. And she didn't need to get approval. She didn't need to do anything like check with a manager. It cost $12 or $15, whatever it cost. That guy who received that pizza, he tells that story all over the place. He remembers that. That's a cool, unexpected thing. But it's because she felt like, I'm helping him, I'm helping his business, and my job is to do the right thing, and, that's a small ask, let me take care of it.
Or something.
So one of the ways you get this done at Google is that you actually take away power from managers. And this is sort of a radical idea, because when you think about what managers do, managers have power over the people who report to them. And Google systematically tries to deprive managers of that kind of power. Talk about that idea and the potential problems it creates in addition to the benefits it brings.
Well, the benefits are people are happier and more productive and they do better things. I mean, if you think about it, it's an amazing thing. Like, as an employee, and we are all employees, what do we want? We want to be left alone. We just want to get our work done. We're going to do a good job. We want to get it done when we need it done, in the way we want to get it done. But we're going to do the right thing, and we're going to do high quality work, typically, if left to our own devices. Again, if you believe people are good, and most of them are. And then as a manager, suddenly you want different things because you're on the hook for other people's work. So the default reaction, the very human reaction is, I'm going to control you, I'm going to tell you what to do. I got to micromanage to make sure things work out the way I want them to work. But what's crazy is, when we're managers, we're also still employees. So we're feeling both these conflicting things, and we default to what, our culture, our heredity, our DNA, whatever, tells us, which is, I'm going to control down, but I want freedom. And if you take that away and instead tell managers, your job is to make teams effective. They're going to do the right thing. You just coach them. You counsel them. And the way we do it is managers don't get to decide who they promote. They don't get to make pay decisions unilaterally. They don't get to choose who goes on their team. They don't get to choose who they hire. All that's done by separate committees at Google, made up of other managers and other employees who make those calls. The effect is, as a manager, the only tools you're left with are, how can I help? And when you come to edit
like project managers,
you actually make your teams better because what they're looking for from you is not control, but guidance and support. And the more carrots you use and the fewer sticks you have, the easier that's going to be. So those are the benefits. And what we find is people innovate more, they stick around at the company longer, they seem happier. And honestly, the happiness by itself is enough of a result. It's kind of the right thing to do and the right way to treat people.
What's the downside?
Well, the downside is if you're trying to drive a big change, it can be a little slow because it's harder in our culture to say, you know what, we're going to do whatever it is. We're going to force this through the organization. We took a run at having a social-based product, Google Plus, a number of years ago. And it was hard to sort of get the whole company to focus on this thing. And our results were, not great. And there were some great things we learned, but overall, could have gone better. And it's in part because you got to convince all these people that this is a big deal and then make sure you have the right idea and make sure it happens in the right way. That takes time.
Yeah, a lot of people, I think, who are workers and employees will find lots to like in your book, but you also have some ideas that might not be as well received. So for one thing, you believe that wide variations in pay among employees might actually be a good thing. You believe in what's sometimes called the power law distribution in salary.
Yeah, that's right. And not just salary, and bonus, and in our case, in stock grants. So the thesis is, normally people assume human performance is normally distributed. You've got kind of a top half, a bottom half, and then within those there's these tails, and you might have 5 or 10% at the top, 5 or 10% at the bottom. And their performance actually looks like that. In reality, we all hear about the 80-20 rule, where 20% of your people generate 80% of your value. In a lot of fields, including software engineering, but also in sales and marketing, your top people generate way more value. And the academic research shows that in profession after profession, the very best people are so much better than average that they actually, generate, 90, 95, 98% of the value or the wins in particular areas. So what that means is, if you're paying everyone, assuming that your very best people are only 10 or 20% better than average, when really they're 50 or 100 or 200 or 500%, you're underpaying your best people. And the effect of that is they're going to want to quit because the market will work over time and they're going to go someplace else where they can get that money. So instead what you have to do is, number one, pay really aggressively for high performance, but number two, you need a system that is just and fair so that you actually can honestly stand in front of your employees and say, this is why this person got that much money. This is what it looks like. And do that in a way that's honorable and ethical and honest. And then employees can look at it and go, okay, I understand the path from where I am to that. The system works, and here's how I move up in the system.
When we come back, I'm going to ask Laszlo Bach about one of the most important parts of his job, finding and spotting great talent. Stay with us.
We'd like to say a quick thank you and share a message from one of our sponsors, AT&T. With the rate of change increasing, businesses today need the agility to do one thing and another. And no one knows and like AT&T. Their network and solutions are helping companies sense and adapt to meet the demands of business, making them more open to innovation and more secure from threats, in the cloud and on the ground. That's the power of and. Support for Hidden Brain also comes from Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo understands that you work hard to get the most out of life. From starting a business to saving for retirement, there are a lot of things you want to accomplish. Working together, Wells Fargo will take the time to understand what you're trying to achieve to help you reach your financial goals. That way you can care for the people and things that matter most. Learn more at wellsfargo.com/together. Wells Fargo. Together, we'll go far.
Check out the NPR One app for your phone. You can use it to listen to Hidden Brain. And it's a great way to find tons of new shows and stories too. Great stories are always waiting you on NPR One. Find it in the App Store now.
Laszlo Bach, I want to spend some time talking about hiring people. Google spends an enormous amount of time recruiting the best talent. Walk me through the evolution of your thinking on how you go about finding the most talented people.
Well, it's been a work in progress. I don't think we're done yet. But it started from the constraint to the company's growth in the early years, even before I joined, was how quickly can we hire people? That was the biggest constraint on Google's growth, is finding great people quickly. And we took a very brute force approach and kind of a naive approach. We said, let's just have as many recruiters as we can, talk to as many people as we can, and let's start with all the fancy schools that we quote unquote know are the places where the smartest people are. And by the way, let's screen for smarts because we're smart people and that's what makes people successful. So that's what we thought. We hit a point where we found that we couldn't find people fast enough, that the people we were hiring weren't always performing as well as we thought, and people we were interviewing were just having awful experiences. When I moved to Silicon Valley, my cab driver, my real estate agent, the checkout clerk at the grocery store, everyone, when they saw I was wearing a Google t-shirt, would say, let me tell you about this person I know who had a terrible experience interviewing with Google. So we did a whole bunch of things, and we're still on this journey to get better at it. But for example, we looked at how many interviews do you need to actually be able to tell whether or not to hire someone. We've been doing 15 to 25 interviews per candidate. Turns out after 4, we got a pretty good sense of who we should hire. We used to look at academic pedigree. What were your test scores? Where'd you go to school? Turns out, doesn't really matter. Your undergraduate performance is a little predictive of your first 2 years of professional performance, but beyond that, none of the stuff matters. And you can find amazing people, as many of your listeners will know, at state schools without degrees. But at Google, we just hadn't learned that lesson. We started kind of naively with what our gut told us, and our gut was wrong.
So since then, you've actually changed and you're looking for different things. So when someone walks in the door, what is it that Google looks for right now?
Yeah, maybe one of the biggest changes to our recruiting and interviewing process has been, rather than just sort of asking brain teasers and problem solvers and all these questions that we thought screened for pure IQ, we actually went back and looked at what are the characteristics of people who've been successful at the company and at other places, and why don't we screen for that instead of using crazy brain teasers or problem solving like, why are manhole covers round, asking what are called structured interview questions, which are actually proven in the academic research to be an accurate way of predicting how someone's going to perform. And we boiled it down to 4 attributes. General cognitive ability. So that's smarts, but it also relates to learning ability and general problem solving, not just how did you do on your SAT. The second thing is what we call emergent leadership. So it's not were you captain of a football team, were you promoted to vice president quickly. It's when you see a problem, do you step in to help fix it? And just as importantly, do you relinquish power and let go of it? The third is what we call googliness. It's kind of a silly word, but basically what it boils down to is conscientiousness, which gets to this question of what people think like owners want to hear. And the second element of googliness is intellectual humility. Not real humility. We have people with big personalities and sometimes bruising personalities, but the kind of humility that lets you say, if I get new facts, I'm going to revise my opinions and perspectives in light of those new facts. That's what we look for. And then the last and least important thing is actually, can you do the job? Because we figure if you have all the other attributes, you'll figure out the job, and maybe you'll come up with something new that the world hasn't seen before.
You must wonder, though, from time to time, whether you're missing great people. So, if you were to run a thought experiment and Larry Page and Sergey Brin, the founders of Google, showed up to be recruited, you think they would be recruited at Google? Would you?
I think they would. I'm not so sure. Well, it's interesting because what you're touching on is this question of sample bias. We're only looking at people who we've hired at Google. Are we overlooking a whole bunch of people that we should be hiring? And so I'd say, first of all, we've tried to widen the span of who we look at and where we look. So for example, over the last 2 years, we went from recruiting at about 150 different campuses just in the US to over 450. And we expanded dramatically to places like the historically black colleges and universities like Howard, to historically heavily Latino universities. We increased our outreach to veterans communities precisely because our sense was we're missing great people. And it wasn't just because it felt like the right thing to do, though it does, but it was also because we just need to find more people. And we're hiring like crazy and growing quickly, and we don't want to overlook people. And we still got a ways to go on that. But the second thing was, we looked at were there people who we had interviewed that we rejected that we should not have rejected, and should we go back and hire them? So for a number of years, we actually would ask candidates in the application process a few questions, 5 to 10 questions, that turned out to be, because of analysis we've done prior to that, we knew would predict performance. And so if somebody was rejected by our hiring process, but they scored well on these 5 to 10 questions, we would go ahead and hire them and put them in jobs. And what we saw was, indeed, these people performed as well or better than people going through our traditional process. And so we changed our process to make sure we were scooping up these people who were otherwise overlooking.
What kind of questions were you asking?
Well, one, for example, was we would ask, on a scale of 1 to 5, rate yourself as a software engineer. And it turns out that if you're a man, the correct answer, the most predictive of success, was I would rate myself a 4 on a scale of 1 to 5. And our hypothesis is that's because men tend to overestimate their capabilities on average. Men tend to be not as self-aware on average as women. And for a man to say 4 was a signal, not the only one, but a signal that maybe this guy's a little more self-aware, maybe he realizes he has something to learn, and that was positively correlated with success here. If you were a woman, however, the score that was most predictive was a 5 out of 5. And our hypothesis there is because there's so much societal pressure on women to be self-effacing and humble and hang back and be modest and wait till they're certain rather than raising their hand at the first opportunity like men on average do. That if a woman says she's a 5, first of all, she's probably going to have higher EQ and social perceptiveness on average. And second, she's going to be amazing. And indeed, that's what we see.
You know, we had Adam Grant from the Wharton School on Hidden Brain some weeks ago talking about his work, and I know he's been someone who's been in your orbit as well. And one of the provocative ideas he discussed with me is the idea that many of the greatest innovators do not actually put their hands up and volunteer. So Michelangelo apparently ran in the opposite direction when he was first asked to paint the Sistine Chapel. Martin Luther King Jr. had no plans to be the leader of the civil rights movement. These were folks who were drafted and then suddenly discovered that they could do amazing things. How do you do this as a company? How do you find talent that isn't looking to be found?
It's a great question. This is part of what we look for when I said we look for emergent leadership. People who, when they see a problem, kind of step in and make it better. And we actually did a piece of work on this. It was inspired by an article actually about Shane Battier when he was playing for the Houston Rockets. And Michael Lewis, who wrote the article, observed, hey, whenever this guy's on the court, the whole team plays better and performs better, but nobody's looking at him as the star. And then eventually people realized there was something there. So similarly, we did a piece of work called Project Aristotle, trying to figure out what makes teams effective and where does innovation come from. And what we found was you can put a bunch of stars together, and that doesn't mean the team's going to be a superstar team. What instead is important is a number of factors, but the underlying one is psychological safety. And if you have a team where there's psychological safety, what happens is these people who normally hang back, who, as you say, as Adam says, often have the best ideas, they feel okay coming forward. And they raise their hands. And teams with high psychological safety, which you can measure and improve, they outperform teams with low psychological safety. And this is particularly important when you're talking about diversity, because it also turns out that teams with high psychological safety benefit tremendously from diversity, and teams without it don't.
I do want to ask about diversity, because Google, like many other tech companies, and in fact many other companies in general, has struggled to boost levels of diversity among its workforce, especially when it comes to women and African Americans and Latinos. What are you doing in people operations specifically, besides going to historically black colleges, for instance? What are the things that you have discovered that work in terms of bringing those people to Google, and more important than that, keeping them at Google?
What we see is that one of the big constraints is our initial starting conditions. So, a couple of years ago, the company was something like 16 on the engineering side. So half the company was engineering. We were about 16 or 17% female. It turns out if we wanted to get to 50% female, we would have to hire only women for the next 6 years. And so that starting condition makes it really hard to make progress as quickly as we'd like, because it turns out, even though I'd love to hire only women, it's illegal to do so. So, what are we doing? Part of it is pipeline. We got to work on that. So we partner with colleges. There's K through 12 programs. We developed a kit called CS First by basically hiring 25 teachers and going to a school district in North Carolina and saying, come up with something. Do whatever you want. Use them however you see fit. And they developed this CS First curriculum that Bill de Blasio is using in New York that's now 250,000 kids have been through. So that's one, getting more people into the field. The second is getting better at recruiting and making sure people see that it's sort of a good place to be, and building networks, because some of this is, if you're African American, you don't immediately think, I got to get to Silicon Valley, right? It's not sort of the first thing, in large part because the industry hasn't been great, but also because there aren't centers of gravity, there are big communities, and we need to fix that. The third is changing our culture inside the company. The tech industry historically has not been very welcoming to women, to blacks, to Latinos. It's only in the last few years it's gotten a better place for people who are LGBT. And so we built an unconscious bias training. And what we've seen is that a greater percentage of Googlers now not only understand discrimination and bias, but they say it is my personal obligation to take action to make this place better. Because ideally what happens is the onus for addressing this shouldn't be on the parties that are in the minority. It should be on the majority to take action and fix things like microaggressions, hiring processes, and culture. Laszlo Bock is heading Google's people operations. He's also the author of the book Work Gurus, Insights from Inside Google that will transform how you live and think. The Hidden Brain podcast is produced by Cara McGrath-Gallison, Maggie Penman, and Max Nestrak. Find more Hidden Brain on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and hear my stories on your local public radio station. I'm Shankar Vedantam, and this is NPR. If you like what we do on Hidden Brain, you should take a listen to Latino USA. Host Maria Hinojosa brings you interviews and stories with a fresh perspective. You'll hear from artists and immigrants, abuelos, and others who are changing the American political, social, and creative landscape. Find Latino USA now on the NPR One app and at npr.org/podcasts.
paintinformation.com, and if you go to
So one of the promptings that I had for this rather informal discussion today is I had a provider of pain care talk to me through paininformation.com. I read them all and I appreciate them all. Talk to me and asked me to talk a little bit more about opioids, and I agree this is a huge subject. It's very contemporary. It's a very tricky subject, and I don't want to go through a lot of statistics on opioids. I'll do that another day. But let's just say there's about 40 people a day that are dying from opioid-related problems. I'm also going to say, of that 40 that die, if you go down the list of ER visits, ICU admissions, and you could keep drilling it down to misuse and abuse as well as diversion, there's a whole bunch of people down there that are misusing, abusing medications up to the tip of the pyramid where we actually have the death, and they're all tragic. All tragic. And opioids have gripped American society. There's a number of causes for it. The first one I'm going to cause, and I'm going to call us out, is iatrogenic addiction. Okay, what is that? Iatrogenic addiction is, I actually coined this term a long time ago because iatrogenic means pretty much from within the medical community. All well-meaning, except for a few pill mills, all interested in the patient's best interest. We want to afford pain relief. Well, in the process of affording pain relief, we also have created somebody that became first dependent on opioids. Dependency is not addiction. They became tolerant on opioids. Tolerance is not addiction by definition. And then they became craving. And craving is not necessarily
No, it's not addiction until bad things start to happen. Okay.
I can tell you from personal experience, when I go into a room and I talk to people about putting them on long-acting medicines or these pharmacokinetically long-acting, what we call LA opioids, and I can tell them, I can give you a medicine, you just have to take once a day. And I can put you on a patch that you don't have to change for 7 days. And they go, oh, I'm not going to get pain relief from that. Why? Yes, you are. We'll get your blood level up and we'll get those mu opioid receptors saturated and you'll be fine. Well, I need my pills. We are a unfortunate pill society. We've been indoctrinated to that. If it's not a pill, if I don't have an active movement 2 or 3 times a day, like the smoker that says I've got to have something in my hand, and it's just this motion thing. It's this principled idea that if you don't take something on a regular basis, it won't work. Not true. Okay. We'll expand on that a little further. So to round it out, the question I had from a listener that was actually a provider of pain care was, please do more on opioids. Can you X, Y, and Z? And I'll do the X, Y, and Z. I'm going to talk about opioids, and I'm going to talk about them at a fairly elevated level, but I never want to talk down people. If you want me to talk more sophisticated, say so. If you want me to present it at MD, PhD level, say so. If you want me to present it as a clinician would, so that there's no barrier to communication to like a patient, say so. But communicate with me, please. And go to iTunes and please review me. Thank you for the reviews. I've gotten 5-star reviews. I thank everyone, and I just appreciate it so much. So, let's talk about this for a second. All right? I go into a room, and this is what I know. I do a brief background check. I don't like to call it anything more than that. I'm not a police officer. I'm not trying to do anything to catch somebody. That's not what I do. What I do is I try to go in with as much information as I can possibly have to afford the best clinical outcome when that interaction ends for the clinic visit.
understanding that I have benchmarks. We've talked about this, 3, 6, 9, and 12 months. If we don't hit those benchmarks, and you help me with these things, patients help me with these things, then I want to know why I'm not hitting those benchmarks. So is it riding in a car? Is it going to a grocery store? Is it anything that you consider enjoyable? Picking up the grandchildren, whatever it is. If we don't hit those benchmarks, I want to know why. And I go in, and I've usually done a criminal background check. And you say, oh my God, what are you doing? I get a lot of information out of that. And it sounds kind of crazy we do that. It is not. Just today, a patient, I went in, they don't know sometimes what I know. I have queried the PDMP, that's the central database where I can see what prescriptions they've got, from what pharmacy, from what physician, when they got them, and the criminal background check. That's public record. And I think that's responsible. Just to a traffic charge last year on a patient who says he's been clean since 1997. I have to take that clinical information into account, because let's face it, if I give this individual with questionable need, a legitimate medical need, a drug, am I giving it really to the community? I don't know. This is part of risk management. We've talked about that. Risk management is really identifying the risk versus the reward. Is giving a drug or a treatment benefiting the individual enough to justify the potential risk? Okay? Risk is loss. Loss can be anything from loss of function, somnolence, they just can't stay awake, loss of quality of life, all the way to loss of life. So, I walk in the room, and this is what I want to do with the new patient. I want to go in, and I want it to be a gentle introduction. My voice is low. I do not make a lot of eye contact. This is my style. I'm not saying this is your style or anybody else's style, but I'm telling you, patients, and I'm telling providers what I do. And I have a foundation of a few decades. So this is what I do with the introduction. Is I go in so no one comes in like a bull in a china store. I'm not charged. I call it charged, where I walk in a room and I know a lot, and I just start saying, well, what about this? What about that? That's not what you want to do. Because on the other side of my credentials are addiction. And I know these people, first of all, they can clean up. Number 2, they can have legitimate pain needs. Number 3, we're not perfect. You know, we're all snowflakes. Sometimes we screw up. And the saying is, most of us do. Most patients screw up on opioids. And that doesn't mean they necessarily intended to. That doesn't mean they necessarily calculated to do it. This is a complicated world. In medication management, in pain management, is complicated. Remember those 5 rules. Into the room I go. My head is lowered, so I'm very quiet. And how you doing? Dr. Hanson, what's going on? How can I help you? That's the most important question. How can I help you? Because I'm trying to get at what's called the chief complaint. What is the chief complaint? It is bothering the patient the most right now. Low back pain. Is that a diagnosis? Well, that's rule 2. You must have a diagnosis. No, low back pain is a symptom. So a lot of times they start telling me about symptoms. And I need to know a diagnosis, because I need to define legitimate medical need to keep the risk-reward benefit way in the patient's favor, way in the community's favor. Okay. So if I am very disarming and they feel non-threatened, and that's exactly what I want, is a non-threatened environment. We are humans, and we are there to be, first of all, a compassionate care provider, but also understanding we have a limited amount of time to connect. Okay, so I'm trying to connect and let them feel like they can speak. Do I like family members back there? Most times, no. I'll talk about that later. Do I want spouses back there? No. Most times, no. We'll talk about that later. There's reasons. And for whatever reason, workman's comp, patients always want somebody question set. Within the question set, I go down history, and then I'll do a physical, and then I'll make medical decision making. Those are the three components to what we do: history, physical, medical decision making. That drives what we do next, clinical action. So based on what I know from previous records, previous conversations with either providers that have taken care of this person, which rarely happens, and my most important interaction with the patient. Remember rule 1, pain is a description, it's not an entity. I am able to put together a plan, and the patient will be thinking of benchmarks. All right, my head's down, and I ask a question, okay, as a process of adherence monitoring, and I do this with most of them, usually do. I need to get a urine sample for a urine drug test or a urine drug screen. It's not really a screen, I don't call it a screen. These are medically necessary. So there's the first step. And usually patients are wonderful about this. Wonderful. They know it's a pain clinic. We have to be careful, and we do adherence monitoring. That's what drug screens. We also explain the patient care agreement. Either I do that or the nurse does that. But there's no barrier to communication. And then we instruct them that there's policies. These aren't rules necessarily, they're policies. Like, we want them to bring their pain meds in at each visit. Or actually, you know what, put all your medicines in a baggie, or in a bag or whatever, and bring them in, and keep them in the original containers. And please, people, don't come in with containers that have like 6 or 7 pills short. Oh, it's in a pill counter at home, or a daily planner at home. Please don't do that. And don't mix all your pills together. Get the number of pills you have in the container and in the proper container. Now, there's something else. A lot of law enforcement communities really get upset when patients have unescorted, I call them unescorted pills. In other words, they aren't in the original container. They're just like in something that they carry in their pocket or something like that. They don't know anything about those pills. They don't know if they're prescribed. Or God forbid they get in an accident. You don't need an impairment. You don't need an impairment charge. You don't need roadside sobriety. You don't need any of these things. So please keep them in the proper containers. And it also helps me understand you. Many times, the referring provider will have, quote, given you just enough to get to the pain clinic. That drives me crazy. I really have no way to do any pill counts and that sort of thing, and then I get the proverbial, I took my last pill today. Or when I ask for a drug screen, is there going to be anything in the drug screen? I said it very softly, non-challenging. Well, I had one put back. I had one in the drawer. Don't tell me that either. Tell me the truth, and I want to hear the truth. That's important. Tell me now. I don't want to hear about scattered pills. I don't want to hear about unaccounted for pills. I don't want to hear a story. This means a lot to me. It means a lot to a provider. It just means accountability. Let's face it, if I'm going to give you these drugs, scheduled drugs, and remember the root word is controlled substances, they are controlled by you and by me. I don't need to hear certain these red flags, because it just changes the conversation and it changes how I think. Now, I'm going to be rating you as a low, medium, or high risk. Don't worry about that. If I deem you a high risk, it's not because I think you're a problem. I think high-risk people sometimes are on certain medications that come to me, like methadone. I think people are high risk that have a lot of comorbid diseases, and they're on a number of medications, and they may have something like sleep apnea, morbidly obese. They may have advanced stage lung disease, that sort of thing. I got to be careful. I got to know what I'm doing here. So, all right, we did the urine screen, and okay, we're going to interpret it in a couple of ways. There's a way of doing it with point of care code. In other words, it's not completely accurate. It's helpful. it's where we can get kind of an immediate reading, and it's not always specific. But I'll tell you something, if it comes back with benzoylene in it, and that's a metabolite of cocaine, it's done. That is cocaine. And you don't get marijuana passively, people. You don't get marijuana passively. If you are popping marijuana positive anywhere in any drug test, you had to have a high concentration blown at you. In other words, you would have known, or you'd have smoked it, or taken it, or something. Now, there are some false positive drugs, and let's be on the scope here of this conversation. But, just remember, when you turn to me, and I'm in that low voice, gentle, non-threatening voice, and you say, I take X, Y, Z, just do this, and I go through this process of informed consent, just so you know what you're getting. Then you say, well, I just want to be honest with you. That's another one of those lines. I hear it all day long. I just want to be honest with you. Well, let me tell you something, and this is to my friends and providers all over that listen to these podcasts. I don't care if they're honest. It's not what I care about. I care about their safety. And they can be the most honest person in the world and be shooting up heroin, telling me about it, and have a fentanyl patch on, and taking benzodiazepines, and I just want to be honest with you. And I want to keep you alive. And this is our conversation here. So, you can be honest with me, but, really, you have to understand my mission is to not only keep you from harming yourself, but harming others. So that's a conversation we have to have. It's called a harms conversation. And I might do something called ESPER. It's kind of a ridiculous set of screwed together letters, and we'll talk about that in some of the addiction actions. But my conversation then changes to a very directed conversation on, are you going to harm yourself or others? And I will ask you, do you wish to harm yourself or others? In other words, I am going to document you have no suicidal ideation, you have no thoughts therein, and you aren't going to go home and do something. I'm also going to ask you, and you're going to say, this is nuts. Why is he asking me all these questions? Who lives with you? Okay, well, what's it like at home? Or where do you work? Or who doesn't work? Your kids go to school, or how old are they? And that sort of thing. I want to know that home situation. Is it a high-risk environment? Is it a chaotic lifestyle? Are there young children at home? And you got a fentanyl patch and it keeps rolling off and falling on the floor? Well, that kid can get it. And that would be tragic. And if you bring this story, my dog ate my pills, or bring me your dead dog.
Bring him the dead dog.
So I don't want to hear things going down the toilet. I don't want to hear things going down the sink. People don't lose their erythromycin prescriptions that way. Just remember, this is going to change my conversation. To me, it's a story. I have to think like this for the safety of all involved. Okay, so where are we at? All right, once I get my data together, and I've talked for a while, I want to pick the right medication for you. Now, we're talking opioids today, and I'm just going to leave it at opioids. I'm not going to go off on vectors and tangents of other medications and adjunctive care. For what you don't know is adjunctive care, it's like I can use supplemental medications like gabapentin, Neurontin, or Graylese is another term used for long-acting. Horizont is another long-acting gabapentin that we know decreases the need for more opioids. It actually is potentially opioid sparing, and that's why acetaminophen is in with hydrocodone. It's opioid sparing. You can use less opioid. Okay, so I'm sticking just to opioids because that conversation, as you can see, can go down 4 different rat holes if I don't watch what I'm saying about what's pertinent. What's pertinent is getting you the right medicine and making sure we have the right conversations. You see where I'm going, right? Okay, so during the interview process, you now see kind of what I'm doing. I'm setting up benchmarks, I'm setting up risk management, and I'm now making, as a medical decision, a choice. Are you a suitable viable candidate, legitimate medical need is met, do we have a diagnosis, can I safely give you these drugs? I mean, it's a home environment all the way backwards. Okay. And what to give you? I'm taking into account comorbid disease, I'm taking into account other medications you're taking. Okay, I'm going to pick a drug. All right, I might say something like this. I notice that you're taking 6 to 10 Percocet a day. The Percocet is oxycodone and Ciccone. Well, that can hurt your liver. All that acetaminophen can hurt your liver. And I have a better drug. And I want this to be quiet, and I want this to be a good conversation. I want you to try some new drugs that I think have better response cycles to your problems. Like you might have a little neuropathy, but you have some pain and this sort of thing, and I have a drug that can help that. What you're driving is a 1998 Impala, and I want to give you a brand new Cadillac. Okay, well, this is something I might hear. Well, what do you mean? Well, what are you going to give me? I have a new drug, and I'm going to call it drug X, Y, and Z. And this drug is brand new, and I'm thinking of a drug, by the way, a real good drug, depending on it. But I have a drug that utilizes newer pharmacologic technology that actually helps neuropathy and does help your pain. Is in some studies, not crossover studies for providers, not crossover, but comparative studies, very similar to oxycodone and pain relief. And it's just a better drug. You're going to drive a Cadillac today. Now remember, people that are not necessarily addicted, but dependent on opioids and very afraid of change, they'll operate on emotion and not logic. So you as providers, and many of you as patients will say, awesome, I want to try something new. This is great. And if you say it's safer, yeah, you know what? You can even abruptly stop this drug. 97% of the time, you won't have any withdrawal. How about that? That's pretty cool. So let's just say you get real sick one weekend, can't take your pill, you're not going to go through withdrawal. Or some other reason. We got to change your medicine. You won't go through. Wow, that's awesome. That's the logical the mind that might be a little hijacked by these medications. So, I know my body pretty good, and this medicine's working really well, and I just don't want to change. I know me, and I know my pain. Well, I know your pain too. I know a lot of things about you that would lend me to believe we want to make a change. But where are we going to go from here? This is called an opioid stress test, okay? And that's what I call it. That's what it's going to be. It's an opioid stress test. It's not unreasonable to change somebody on different drugs to either enhance the effectiveness of these drugs or to reduce the risk or to take into account comorbid problems or other medications. It's not unreasonable. And I'm not being an unreasonable physician for asking you to try it. And I can tell you this is part of the rules. This is part of a policy. I'm going to give you maybe a new drug that I think is in your best interest. Don't go to the parking lot and get on your smartphone and be looking up what it does, or go to bluelight.com or opiophile.org and looking at these rather questionable sites and look at what other people are saying about them in like chat rooms and things like that, because I'll know. And getting a phone call 2 hours later when I start you on a fentanyl patch and says, oh, I'm throwing up and I can't take it, I've got to have something else, I've got to have my oxycodone back. Well, it takes 11 hours for fentanyl to get into you, basically to go transdermally. Okay, that's not going to work. How about I give you some of these brand new drugs? Well, don't look up that one of the side effects is it may cause shortness of breath, or may cause headache, or may cause dizziness. They all do. If water was invented today, it would have a black box warning that says you can drown. Let's just face it, when these drugs are being tested and being FDA approved through that rather rigorous process, except for marijuana, go figure, Well, the people in these later phases of the trial list all the side effects. Well, if it's listed as a side effect, it goes in the PDR, it goes into the informational materials, and that's the way the system works. It doesn't mean necessarily many people are going to have that problem. Most companies, when they do these studies or comparative analysis or retrospective analysis, cohort studies, whatever you want to call it, they will list and compare other drugs, and you will have a good idea what the real side effects are. And the real side effects of some of these drugs that the patients want to get back on are far exceeding the potential theoretical risks of some of the other really good new drugs. Let's face it, the FDA does not want a new opioid to come to the market without abuse deterrent technology. In other words, the technology to avoid people from crushing and snorting, injecting, and that sort of thing. These abuse deterrent technologies, as you've heard in other podcasts, are great. They're going to save lives. But patients sometimes don't like them, and they know it. I can tell. So when I write a drug, and they say, does that have that wrapper on it? Because my stomach, it's terrible. It's like once I throw up. That wrapper makes my stomach throw up. Red flag, don't tell me that. That's the abuse deterrent technology. It doesn't do that. You know, there may be some reports of some people that feel that it does this sort of thing, but it's a red flag. And I really want to give you what you need, not necessarily what you want. And that's going to be responsible prescribing habit. Remember Rule 4. Know thy meds, know thy categories, and know meds in those categories. That was from one of those early podcasts. I'm sorry, they were terrible. But I get the information across. There are 5 rules and 5 rules. I live by those. So, okay, I've picked on medicine. We've had our conversation, and you go get it filled. Well, I do take into account, this is America, that insurance companies can be quirky on some of these medicines. For the life of me, I don't know why they will let me prescribe some and not others. For some insurance companies, they'll let me prescribe some of the riskiest medicines out there vis-a-vis cheap generic medicines, and I can't give you the best ones on the planet that are safe and better. I call it more betterer. They have a financial incentive for me to prescribe, say, methadone. Well, not a good choice for a lot of patients. So, yeah, it's cheap. Maybe $8, $10 a month. Or how about Cicconoe? Well, yeah, it's cheap, but it's snortable. I don't want this person getting this. They have legitimate medical need. I've got other good drugs. Let me try something different. So you get the point. All right, you go to the grocery store, wherever you get your medicine filled, and okay, great. You get the drug. You go home with it. Remember, one pill does not change your life.
Don't take the pill.
You can't say to me, I don't have my Cicconoe for breakthrough. You just gave me that long-acting medicine, and I need that midday Cicconoe or I'm in the bed. Don't tell me that one pill is going to change your life like that. That's an enormous red flag for me. No, these drugs develop a serum level. It may take 5 half-lives, or it may take a little bit of time, but they're going to get there, and when they get to the serum level that is therapeutic, you're really probably not going to need a breakthrough medicine, because the medicine's on there. It's occupying the mu receptor. It's sitting there. Let it do its job. Quit focusing on the pills, the motion like we talked about of taking a pill. All right, so next, what do? We see him back. And we see him back based on a number of issues. Okay? So the question is, when we bring them in, what are we asking? We're asking patients to be compliant. Please follow directions. We're asking them to follow the patient care agreement. It's not a contract, but it's an opioid agreement that you're going to go to one pharmacy consent. That's really a lot on the provider to make sure that the patient understands risk reward, all these things we talked about, potential for dependency, tolerance, even potential addiction. So based on the risk, high risk, medium, low risk, they come back. Okay, they come back, it might be 48 hours. They may come back in 2 weeks. They may come back in a month. Or it might be that lollop, that little old lady in pain, that beautiful lady we love. She might be able to be extended out. It depends on circumstances, distance to travel, convenience to travel, travelability, and you're just going to have to make a good clinical decision and document it. That's important. You will be challenged, my good people, if you've come a long way to see a provider and you passed a few other pain clinics along the way or sources for pain control. Somebody may want to know, and I've been involved in this situation with somebody, I actually defended them, that patients came a long way to see this one provider, and the red flag is that an easy provider to get good since that uphill mill. Now, there's a lot of reasons. Sometimes people have to go to certain providers, and it has to do with expertise, and it has to do with willingness to treat certain disease states. It has a lot of things to do, so you have to defend them. So that's documented. All right, they come back. A process of adherence monitoring. If you need to get another urine, you listen to the little voice. It's not predetermined. I don't want to be hearing that I do them, quote, randomly. We do urine drug screens based on need. Okay, it's a defined need. That defined need is made by the clinical experience, by the patient experience, by a lot of database enhancements like querying the PDMP, some maybe quirky comments made during the interview process and that sort of thing. It's very much provider's responsibility to understand when to get it, and it is by need. It isn't random. I don't want to hear about rolling some dice or something like that. You may have somebody that they had a little bit of a history, a little hiccup at one time, and they had a little bit of problem in their life, but they're cleaned up, they're straight, they're good. They may not need a urine drug screen for half a year, but then there's sometimes that little old lady in pain. That young man, I give my nephew my Ciccone, and he gives me money so I can pay my rent or my heating bill or something like that. That happens. Everybody's a snowflake, but use good clinical guidance. That's
Laurel Mountain Summit, Allegheny Mountains, 24.
All right, so
this is actually
let's take a next step.
Most of the time.
How long are they going to be on these medications? Pain is not an opioid deficiency. Okay, it's not normal for you to have opioids running around in your blood system.
But it starts out.
People say, well, you have endogenous opioids. What do I mean by that? You have enkephalins and endorphins, and you have all these things floating around that are normally inside of you. Yeah, so what? You have them inside of you. Your body's used to having them inside of you. I am talking about synthetic and man-made opioids, and those that are coming from everything from opium extraction on down. Those aren't meant to be in you. Those have a strong dopamine response that can become habitual very fast. In my addiction practice, I do see younger people fastest absorbed into this world of addiction. They don't mean to be there, but they may have broken their leg or something, and now they can't go without the oxycodone and start doing things they never thought they would do. So we have to always be thinking, do we have an exit strategy here? Are they going to be on opioids for the rest of their life? Well, yeah, maybe. There is that cancer diagnosis, goes back to rule 2. Maybe they have had miserable failed back surgery syndrome, or they have arachnoiditis. Maybe they have a peripheral neuropathy that's responding nicely to this medication you had them on, has a dual mechanism of action, like Ciccone, I could talk about. And it works just so beautifully with them. They don't need a lot of other adjunctive medications that had a lot of side effects or sedating side effects or intolerable side effects. And this is a good drug. Well, they're not showing any misuse, abuse, or diversion, aberrant a year, you can bet we're going to be really careful. Absolutely. I'm surprised more people don't just join the uproar over opioid misuse, abuse, and conversion. Because there a few people had troubles with Vioxx, remember that? The replication. A few people mounted a number of lawsuits. A few people had problems. What about 19,000 people more than car wrecks? You'd think there would be public outrage. Well, okay, I don't want to get into availability during this talk, but I will tell you, I think it's the American Medical Association, I think it is, they just dropped the 5th vital sign. So, opioids were, quote, the 5th vital sign. This got us in this mess, where I looked at an individual in the hospital, or I looked at an individual in my clinic, and we asked them about their opioids. It was felt that they should be given the relief they need despite opioid dosing. And the Federation of State Medical Boards and others pretty much embraced it, endorsed it, and it was on flawed methodology. And guess what? That's kind of how we got here. And it's not the only way we got here, but I think they finally agreed with most pain practitioners the 5th pathway is ridiculous, and it's just going to lead to more problems. So hats off to them. Kudos. And once again, visit me at paininformation.com. Leave a review of this rant. But I hope it's useful to not only patients to understand the process, but also to providers to just see what the world is inside our head. I can tell you, the light at the end of the tunnel is in the truck, and pain management practitioners, they're not a black hole. We usually have a plan, and it's not just a monthly prescription. And for primary care physicians and others that do treat pain, they may not have a lot of training, but really want to help people, say in rural areas, they just don't have access to pain clinics and that sort of thing, or fellowship-trained pain providers, etc. It's okay. Don't practice in fear. Practice by that little voice that you hear. You know what's right and wrong. You know where the red flags are. Please go in armed to see patients with as much information to help them and help the community. It is not a moral failing to have a hiccup or two, and it's going to happen. Don't get frustrated with patients. Love them where they're at. You can't cure everybody, but you can help them heal. Okay? And with that, I will talk to you soon. This is Pain Information Network. Welcome back. This is the world according to me, and this is an interesting story today, very impactful, given to me by my wife Kathy. And I think this is a private type of person that doesn't want to be credited by name, just from some transmissions that we've had. But I'll give her initials, KS. Thank you for being you. Good job. Good job standing up, and a lot of integrity. She's in Austin, Texas. This is about a gentleman named Craig and the dog DJ. The story is this. I'm sorry this is so long, but please read. Today I witnessed something that made me very angry, and it was anger at my generation. I was walking through Walmart when I saw a group of 4 children between the ages of 4 and 8 crowding around a gentleman and his service dog. The dog, a young cattle dog, and I learned the name later was Django, was doing the best that he could to put himself between these children and his handler. But they were backed into a corner and surrounded. The gentleman, whose name I later learned was Craig, was clearly distressed. My first thought was, where are the parents? Well, I looked around but didn't see anyone around who I thought might be responsible. The oldest oldest child reached out and grabbed Django's tail hard enough to make him yelp. Django did not become distracted and continued to do his job. At this point, Craig was very agitated and he was white as a sheet. At this point, I decided I couldn't just do nothing, so I calmly walked through the children and went to Craig's side. I'm not sure why these words came out of my mouth, but I looked at him and said, "We have your back. Trust your partner." The look of relief on his face is something that'll stick with me for the rest of my life. I proceeded to take control of these children and get them away from his team. The oldest was particularly taken by surprise by this turn of events and quickly and rudely proclaimed, "You're my mommy." My thoughts were absolutely, "No, I am not your mommy, and where the hell is your so-called mother?" I ignored him and looked to the three youngest. I spoke to them, hoping that the oldest would listen as well. I first asked them if they knew why Django was in a store that they don't normally see dogs. Of course, none of them knew. I asked them if they knew what they should do when they saw a service dog. Of course, none of them knew. Then I asked if they knew what a service dog was. None of them knew. I then told them what a service dog is and how they help people have normal lives. I told them how they can really even save people's lives. I told them why it could be dangerous for someone to distract a service dog. All but the oldest, they listened intently. Out of the corner of my eye, I see Craig kneeling with Django. Django was completely focused on his handler, so I turned my focus back to the children. I asked them all these questions, and the youngest three answered perfectly. The oldest looked at me, and I doubted I had gotten through to him, and that made me very sad. He then said something that left me breathless. "You mean they're really dogs that can tell me when I'm going to have a seizure?" My mind was screaming. Where the blank is this boy's mother, and why would she think it was all okay to leave him alone? I told him yes, and I talked with him about how they do it. I had him. I got through it. I'd asked him where their parents were. The oldest pointed to two women about my age who were completely absorbed in their clothes, shopping, and on their phones. My heart broke because I knew there was really nothing I could do. I'd been speaking with these children for several minutes, and they hadn't so much as looked up and said, "Where are my kids?" They didn't know where they were. They weren't looking for them. I told them they should thank Craig for his service and then go tell their parents everything that they had learned and to leave nothing out. This is where they scampered off, and I turned back to Craig and to Django. I offered to walk with him while he finished his shopping, which he gratefully accepted. He talked to me and I just listened. He has been on 2 tours overseas. On his second, his unit was pinned down. Only 3 soldiers survived. He was injured, causing blindness in one eye. He came home and was diagnosed with severe PTSD. He struggled for a long time to integrate into civilian life. 2 months ago, he was paired with a PTSD service dog. That dog is Django. That's right, 2 months. Django's dedication to his handler, who really he has only known for 2 months of his life, shows the amazing bonds these dogs form. Even as I walked with him, Django kept himself between me and Craig. He had one eye on his person and one eye on me. We continued to walk, but he shied away from discussion about him. So I told him about me and my cattle dogs. I showed him pictures of Hiccup. His eyes lit up. Django loves to play frisbee in the backyard. I walked him through his line into his car. I helped him unload. I got his things in his car, and I bid him farewell. I didn't offer my hand, as I know touch could be uncomfortable. He offered his, though, then hesitantly gave me a small hug. You guys have to understand how difficult it is for someone with PTSD to offer that to a stranger. I'm honored to have been of service to him when he has done so much in his service to us. Please, I beg you, teach your children about service dogs. Teach them that they should never interrupt a team. It can have very dangerous consequences. That's why. This is Pain Information Network. This one's not too comfortable. Yeah, I'm going to talk today about overdose prevention. And prevention, I'm talking about prevention, and this does not necessarily mean bad outcome. This may mean really good outcome. All right, let's look at this, and I'm going to credit Dr. Silverman for a lot of this. He has spoken a lot about this, and I agree with him on the major points. What I don't like to hear or see is that overdose prevention is simple and easy. It's not. It really requires a certain depth of knowledge. For example, you can't just reverse somebody from an opioid-induced coma using an unknown agent in an unknown dose without having problems. I mean, you throw people in florid withdrawal, and if you've never seen withdrawal, I think you'll be impressed. When you see it come on within 15 to 20 seconds, it's usually a situation that requires real intervention and real understanding how to do something about it. That's not to say we shouldn't have the tools. Now, SAMHSA is an organization in the U.S. government that recommends these tools. We'll talk about that. All right, so believe it or not, you start to see overdose deaths by real intent starting between age 10 to 14 going up to 85 plus. Actually, there's a blip down at 65 to 74, but it starts going up again. Go figure. I imagine there's a lot of stories behind that, and some have to do with chronic disease. All right, characteristics of unintentional prescription overdose deaths, and they looked at Utah. I think that substance abuse you'd expect. I think you'd expect it to be pretty high. It's around 60%. But non-medical use, in other words, somebody just borrowing a prescription from the medicine cabinet of grandpa, well, that's 51%. It's right there. How about history of chronic pain? 82%. Now that's high. Now this number is only 155, and it was in 2008, 2009. So these numbers are going to be different, but they're going to be on the heels of reality. Mental illness diagnosed by a provider, 57. That's not that high of a percentage. All that equals 100%. We just got to look at numbers. We've got to have to figure out some kind of numbers so we can develop an action plan. Use of multiple prescribers. In other words, you've heard of these people, these doctor shoppers. And again, this goes back between 8 to 10 years, but it's pretty relevant. It's about 16 to 25%, and it depends on how many prescriptions you get over what period of time. So if you get it from over 5 prescribers, that number was about 295, it's 21%. That's pretty high. And the summary is it's male sex predominant, age 45 to 54, and that's from opioids. But we are having that big spike now, these young kids finding out what heroin is, 25 to 34, all right? It's not Hispanic, and it's going into the affluent communities. Why? Because everybody wants to kind of have a bump. The non-metro counties, they love the opioid analgesics, but the metro counties, the affluent people, they like heroin. So it also depends on your state. It really depends on just personality, prescription, history, how easy it has been to really get your prescriptions, and just the desire for non-medical use. Now we're starting to see the route of administration being a problem, and the snorting, the IV injectables, and therefore the FDA has said, okay, you want to introduce a new opioid, it's going to have abuse deterrent technology. So that's a requirement now for any new opioid. And we're not really seeing new opioids. We saw Tapentadol, that's the most recent one, but it's just kind of rehashed oxycodones, hydrocodones in different formulations, and that's fine. They're really good medicines. The problem is if you don't have a way figured out to keep them from getting misused, abused, or sent somewhere to the medicine cabinet and then to the pill party, they're a problem, especially if they're pure opioid agonists. They don't have anything else in them, like hydrocodone or something like that. Other problems that affect opioid overdose have to do with comorbid medical disease. Well, it makes sense. Sleep apnea, you're overweight, psychiatric disorder, you like a little too much alcohol or prior substance abuse, lung disease, that sort of thing. And unfortunately, God bless our veterans. We love you all. You're at risk. Children that get their hands on them. This is the big one, people. And I can't drive this home enough. Whenever I deal with someone in office, many of you know I'm very interested in addiction, born in addiction. I tell them, look, you're going to fall off the wagon. Everybody has their moments, and we all screw up. But if you feel like you're going to fall off the wagon and go back to heroin, do not go back to your previous dose. You don't have tolerance. Let's say you just were incarcerated, and this is a risk factor. You get out of jail, you're going to go right to your dealer. I got to have a fix. He's going to give you either that old dose of heroin or that new fun stuff, the front row seat that has fentanyl. And that's a recipe for disaster. All right. Other medications can lead to problems. We know our benzodiazepines and our sedatives like any of the butylbitols, these sort of drugs that have barbiturates in them. Be careful, those headache medicines and the like. Booze, that's a big one too. All right, I mentioned the I mentioned the SAMHSA. That's a mouthful. Opioid Overdose Toolkit. What it is it's this naloxone, which is a reversal for opioids, that we can put together to administer in a number of different ways. It can be from IM, IV, you can put it in the nose, and you have these new devices that talk you through it. They literally have a voice that says, open, press button, place on thigh, fire, that sort of thing. I'm oversimplifying it, but they literally have come up with these types of technologies, and they work. And I've heard the numbers are pretty good. Let's make sure our fire departments, our police departments, let's make sure our family members, sometimes bystanders, just so many people have these things. Let's put them in our offices. So as healthcare providers, we have it in our office. Somebody will invariably, once or twice a year, pull somebody through the door that says, hey, we need help. Do you know how to do something here? Well, yeah, we can do the standard resuscitation and dial 911. Of course, we're going to do that. But I can tell you what I would do, and I would do without hesitation, is use these reversal agents. Let me tell you how far back I go. I was a paramedic for the city and county of Denver, late 70s, early 80s. That's how far back I go. And we had some potent drugs back then, but people didn't take drugs like they do now. So a little went a long way. And we had Narcan, and this drug was kind of new. It reversed opioids, and it was in our resuscitation protocol. So we go down the line, we would not only give sugar for diabetes, hypoglycemia, we would give Narcan. I mean, we did everything we could. And if I got a reversal on the Narcan, and this is a point I want to drive home, I have to remember about redistribution. I've seen it, I've lived it, and this is just something you need to doses of Narcan. So let's just say 15, 20 minutes down the line, people are starting to get sleepy again from their original overdose. Things just don't look right. Hit them again. Give them more Narcan. We used to put quite a few vials in an IV bag and just slowly infuse it. And that kept people from having this floored withdrawal where they just wake up and they are not happy and they hurt and they're throwing up and they have fluids coming out of every orifice, and that's basically what withdrawal is. So what about you? Are you going to give these things? Well, a number of states have Good Samaritan laws, and the important, I think the most important thing is the community understands that if you give this drug and you bring somebody back, that doesn't mean you're going to go to jail. I think quite the opposite. You're going to be appreciated by not only the healthcare professional, the paramedic or whoever, but law enforcement, the fire department, because you don't have to fear legal consequences. We want you to help. So let's just say you or a family member have a heroin problem. Get this thing in the house, this auto-injector, or get the nasal application. Carry it around like you carry around the epinephrine for bee stings, the auto-injectors. Just have it ready, because as you know, addiction pulls you. It pulls you into a world that you never thought you'd be in. Not a moral failure, but it is physiologic. It is something that you react emotion over logic, and you're just going to need a little bit of help, but you're also going to need a rescue. All right. Please leave a review at paininformation.com, and I really would appreciate if you'd subscribe to this podcast. It's going to help me rate. I think I'm seeing this slip backwards. It may just be the time of year or whatever, but I want people to hear this stuff, and we are going to speak as intelligently with the best information possible to keep you happy, healthy, safe, get your pain control when it needs to be controlled, and most importantly, improve your quality of life. So go to iTunes, help us out there, and go to paininformation.com, and I read all your comments. I've had some real interesting comments lately, and that's why I did this one today. If you want to hear more about opioids, I'm going to do 4 rules, and that's coming up. More interviews, and I will look forward to hearing from you, and I'll see you in a week.
Presented by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. CDC. Safer, healthier people.
Hello, I'm Ted Pastorius, and I'm here with Dr. Greg Dash, the rickettsial team leader in the CDC's rickettsial zoonosis branch. Today, we're talking about a paper that appears in the July 2009 issue of CDC's journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases. The article describes a cluster of cases of sovatic typhus, which occurred at a wilderness camp in southwestern Pennsylvania between 2004 and 2006. Dr. Dash, this sounds like a really interesting investigation. Why don't you start by telling us a little about the background for this joint study by the CDC and the Pennsylvania Department of Health?
Ted, we were quite sure that the initial case detected in our laboratory was sylvatic typhus. This was because of the location of the case, the time of year, and the specific type of antibodies detected in this person in the clinical presentation. Our branch had just published 2 papers on this subject in 2003 and 2004, as well as earlier reviews on this subject. However, most sylvatic typhus cases are sporadic and isolated, although a few situations where several individuals in a household have experienced sylvatic typhus. We were
very concerned that this had occurred in a site with many children and counselors and wanted to ensure that no more cases would occur. However, any good investigation starts with a medical investigation to see if other cases had occurred there previously. The ill individual recalled a previous similar case at this site, and the Pennsylvania Department of Health confirmed it in their records. After that, it was a matter of finding out what exposures these two individuals had in common. To our surprise, two other individuals also had slept in the same bed, had been ill, and had antibodies to Rickettsia protezki. So our concern about taking preventive measures was right on the money.
Sylvatic typhus is very uncommon in the United States. How did counselors get it?
It is relatively uncommon. In fact, only 41 cases of sylvatic typhus have been well documented in the United States since its discovery in 1975. Only 2 other cases have been described in Pennsylvania in the 25-year period between 1976 and 2001. However, we suspect that cases of sylvatic typhus are frequently missed in the eastern United States, much as 2 of the 4 cases described in this article were initially missed because they did not seek medical attention. Our investigation confirmed that flying squirrels had free access to a number of cabins at this site, and most importantly, that all 4 individuals had slept right beside a nesting site in the wall which contained flying squirrels. Since the wall was not fully sealed, the squirrels could enter the cabin from the nest, and debris from their nest could fall on the beds where the counselors slept. From an epidemiology standpoint, it was very important that none of the other individuals sleeping in the cabin had been infected. Even counselors sleeping in a bed just a yard away from the bed where exposure occurred. The rest of the investigation merely confirmed that the flying squirrels were common at the camp, that they all had fleas, and that the squirrels had evidence of infection with Rickettsia protezki.
What does this cluster of cases tell us? And specifically, what should people know who are visiting or living in areas of the United States where there are flying squirrels, and how they can stay safe while they're there?
The most important finding is that intimate contact with actively occupied flying squirrel nests and their ectoparasites is probably required for transmission. Squirrels present in the nearby habitat or even running through the cabins pose little risk. Consequently, effective barrier exclusion of squirrels from human habitations can probably prevent most cases of sylvatic typhus. This means that all external holes in siding, doors, attics, or flooring or ceiling joists need to be closed with heavy gauge screen. Simple removal of flying squirrels without use of insecticides to kill their ectoparasites is a bad idea, as the ectoparasites may then seek a human host. However, people are known to keep squirrels as pets, and this can pose a risk of infection. Others who may come into contact with squirrel nests during pursuit of their occupations or hobbies, such as bird lovers, construction workers, arborists, or conservationists, who may have contact with woodpecker holes or squirrel nests in trees or other sites, should also take precautions to minimize exposure to the nesting materials, which may have ectoparasites or infected ectoparasite feces.
So where can this disease occur?
Nearly all cases of sylvatic typhus have occurred in areas within the distribution of the southern flying squirrel, Ciccone volans, including Massachusetts, across New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, all the way to Wisconsin, throughout the mid-Atlantic states, down to Florida, and west to eastern Texas and Arkansas. However, the northern flying squirrel, Ciccone sabrinus, is also found in areas that overlap with the southern flying squirrel, and its distribution extends across to the northern USA, into Canada, and has pockets in the western United States, including California, where 1 case of sylvatic typhus has been documented. We do not know if one race or species of flying squirrels is more likely to be infected with Rickettsia protezki, although it's clear that the southern flying squirrel is heavily infected. Since we don't know this information, the best advice is to avoid contact with them altogether. Indeed, because they are a nocturnal species and fly from one nesting site to another, many people are not even aware they are there. Our listeners should not assume that these squirrels are only found in wilderness camps in the Appalachian Mountains. The squirrels can reside in many habitats, with trees and good nesting holes, that often seek warmer homes and buildings during the cold winter months. And this is when transmission of sylvatic typhus occurs most frequently.
So, what are the symptoms of sylvatic typhus, and when should people seek care?
Anyone who becomes ill with fever, chills, and sweats, or has a severe headache or rash accompanying these general symptoms should see a physician. It is very important to report environmental clues like suspected flea bites and exposure to flying squirrels, and to ask for appropriate testing of blood samples for rickettsial infections. Rickettsial infections like sylvatic typhus are very treatable, but the later treatment begins, the greater the chance that these illnesses will cause extended hospitalizations, or potentially even fatal infections, or indeed cause persistent long-term effects even after treatment.
Well, thank you so much for discussing these issues with us, Dr. Dash. We've been talking today about a paper that appears in the July 2009 issue of CDC's journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases. You can see the whole article online at www.cdc.gov/EID. And if you'd like to comment on our podcast, send us an email to eideditor@cdc.gov. That's eideditor@cdc.gov. I'm Ted Pastorius of Emerging Infectious Diseases. Thank you for listening, and have a healthy day.
For the most accurate health information, visit www.cdc.gov or call 1-800-CDC-INFO 24/7. This podcast is presented by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. CDC, safer, healthier people.
Hello, I'm Ted Pastorius, and I'm here today with Dr. Scott Dell, the Director of the Division of Global Disease Detection and Emergency Response at CDC's Coordinating Office on Global Health. Today, we're talking about a paper in the September 2009 issue of CDC's journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases. The article describes the identification of the first 3 cases of pandemic influenza, H1N1, in China, and the following investigation by Chinese health authorities. Dr. Dell, let's start by setting the stage for this paper. Can you tell us a little bit about what was going on in April 2009 when these first cases emerged?
Mid-April of 2009 was when the first cases emerged in Mexico. They were identified as severe unexplained pneumonia, and clusters of them were identified in the Mexico City area and several other parts of the country. At about the same time, in Southern California, a surveillance system that CDC was assisting with identified 2 children who had a new strain of influenza. It was a variation of swine flu, and it wasn't until the latter part of April when those 2 events were linked together and it became clear that this new influenza virus was causing widespread disease in Mexico. It was quickly apparent that this was an efficiently transmitted human pathogen, which was something that other flu viruses, like the avian flu H5N1 virus, wasn't able to do.
This has got to be a concerning time from a public health standpoint. We've got a brand new virus spreading quickly, and at that time we really don't know how severe it's going to turn out to be. So as I understand it, in early May, China began a new surveillance network to track potential cases. Can you tell us a little bit about how that worked?
China has an impressive ability to bring together public health surveillance. They really ramped up these efforts in the wake of the SARS epidemic and their experience with H5N1 virus. So beginning May 7th of 2009, China set up a national network which included the Ministry of Health, the China CDC, and various hospitals around the country. They looked for suspect cases which were defined as people who had a syndrome consistent with influenza and had either traveled or had contact with travelers.
And I guess through that they identified the first 3 cases in China, who happened to be students who'd been studying here in the United States and in Canada and returned home to visit family and friends. Can you tell us a bit more about the specific cases?
As you say, the first identified cases in China, and this was true in many other countries as well, were all in travelers. These were 3 healthy young Chinese students who had been studying abroad, 2 in the U.S. and 1 in Canada, and all 3 of them returned home to visit their family and friends sometime between May 7th and 10th. The first patient got sick while on a flight from Beijing to Chengdu, another while on a train from Beijing to Jinan, and the third got sick 3 days after arriving in Beijing. All 3 of them had flu-like symptoms, similar to seasonal influenza, and each of them tested positive for the new strain of H1N1 influenza and recovered fairly quickly.
Since all of these cases involve travel, which can obviously put ill people in very close contact with a large number of well people, how did China go about investigating to see if the 3 cases made other people sick?
They look for contacts of these patients, and it's impressive the varied number of contacts in the 3 cases. 144 contacts were identified from the first patient, mostly who rode on the plane from Beijing to Chengdu. The second patient had 40 contacts, mainly on that train, and the third case only had 2 close contacts identified. One was her mother and the other was a taxi driver.
Then once the contacts were identified, what did the Chinese health officials do? Did they test the contacts to see if they were also infected? If so, what were the results?
The health officials in China were aggressive in this case, as they have been throughout this epidemic. They quarantined the contacts for 7 days for medical observation, and they tested them to see if they were infected. Of all of those contacts, only one tested positive. That was the mother of the third patient, who was asymptomatic, but probably caught the H1N1 because she was in very close proximity to her daughter while she was ill.
Was it surprising that none of the other contacts got sick, especially given the considerations of travel?
It's an interesting question about the transmissibility of this virus to other travelers. We do know a great deal now about the transmissibility of the new H1N1 virus, and we have a variety of estimates, primarily from household attack rates, which average about 10% overall, but there's a wide variation in the proportion of household contacts who become infected as a result of their contact with an ill patient. Travelers are a little bit of a different story, and there's an even wider variation in attack rates among travelers. And of course, one assumes that it depends on the degree of close contact between the ill person and the travelers, as well as the stage of illness while the person was traveling.
Some experts are predicting that this virus is going to come back stronger in the fall during the Northern Hemisphere's regular flu season. What should people know about that?
It is likely that the H1N1 will continue to spread and will return in the fall of 2009. It isn't clear what the severity will be. It may be the same or different, more severe or less severe than what we saw in the spring. But regardless of the severity in the coming wave, this is a pathogen that deserves respect. It's clearly an efficient human pathogen. It generally causes mild disease, but it does have the potential in rare cases to cause severe disease among young persons.
I assume that we're on the lookout for that?
We're continuing to experience H1N1 disease in the U.S. throughout the summer, which is highly unusual. So as a consequence, we are preparing for the return of this pathogen anticipated in the fall of 2009 by ramping up our surveillance, by moving ahead with vaccine development work, and by moving ahead with communicating with the public on what they can do to protect themselves.
Thanks so much for discussing this issue with us, Dr. We've been talking today about a paper in the September 2009 issue of CDC's journal Emerging Infectious Diseases. You can see the whole article online at www.cdc.gov/EID. If you'd like to comment on our podcast, please send us an email to eid@cdc.gov. I'm Ted Pastorius for Emerging Infectious Diseases. Thank you for listening, and have a healthy day.
For the most accurate health information, visit www.cdc.gov or call 1-800-CDC-INFO 24/7. This podcast is presented by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. CDC, safer, healthier people.
Hello, I'm Ted Pastorius, and I'm speaking today with Dr. Carrie Reed, an epidemiologist in the Influenza Division at the Centers for Disease Makes a lot of sense. So can you explain how you developed the model to estimate the true number of cases then?
Sure. We thought about these various sources of ways that somebody might not get included in our confirmed case counts. And we tried to think of ways that we could estimate what the proportion at each of these levels was. For example, what proportion of people went to the doctor if they got sick? What proportion of people that went to the doctor would get tested? And so we looked through a number of different surveys that we've done of patients in the community, of different investigations that we've done early on in the epidemic to try and get a sense of what these proportions were. And then once we knew what those were, we could work backwards from the number of confirmed cases to figure out what the estimated number of true cases were in the community.
With that in mind, what's your estimate of how many cases actually occurred between April and July of 2001?
So based on these surveys and the data that we got from these surveys, we estimate that on average about 79 times as many cases were actually out there than were reported. And this would estimate about 3 million cases were out there in the community. And of those, about 14,000 would have been hospitalized.
Why is this important? Why do we want to have a better idea of the actual number of cases?
We were worried if we're just talking about 43,000 confirmed cases, and we know that's an underestimate of the total number of cases, that might not be a good way to base our plans and our estimates of what might happen in the fall. And so just thinking about it, you would make plans very differently for 43,000 cases than you might for 3 million cases, or for 14,000 hospitalizations instead of 5,000 hospitalizations. And so we didn't want to run the risk of underestimating the impact that this was having in the community. And so we really wanted to come up with a better way of understanding how much actual disease was out there during this spring wave.
Can you use the same model for other diseases, or is it only for influenza?
We've actually used this type of model before here at CDC to estimate the impact of foodborne disease in the United States, which we know is also underestimated for similar reasons that influenza is.
So therefore you're very confident that the number of now estimated cases is famous for having
it's not perfect, but it's definitely better than just relying on the number of confirmed cases that we have out there.
Well, thanks so much for discussing your article with us, Dr. Reed. We've been talking about a paper that appears in the December 2009 issue of CDC's journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases. And you can see the whole article online at www.cdc.gov/EID. If you'd like to comment on our podcast, please send us an email to eideditor@cdc.gov. For Emerging Infectious Diseases, I'm Ted Pastorius. Thanks for listening, and have a healthy day.
For the most accurate health information, visit www.cdc.gov or call 1-800-CDC-INFO 24/7.
Just pick up the phone.
This podcast is presented by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. CDC. Safer, healthier people.
Hello, I'm Karen Hunter. With me today is Dr. Dixie Snyder, Senior Advisor in CDC's Office of the Director. We're talking about a paper in the February 2010 issue of CDC's journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases. The article looks at the increase in drug-resistant tuberculosis and the emergence of extensively drug-resistant TB at a gold mine in South Africa. Welcome, Dr. Snyder.
Thank you, Karen. It's good to be here.
Dr. Snyder, the authors of this paper describe a drug-resistant TB outbreak at a South African gold mine between 2003 and 2005. Would you start by describing the outbreak, specifically the drug resistance that was seen?
During that period, the authors examined 3,003 patients with tuberculosis. And of that number, 128 had drug resistance. And of the 128, alarmingly, 108 had multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis. And then a subset of those had extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis, 5 cases. But then a number of other cases had resistance to quite a number of drugs.
Drug-resistant TB poses more of a concern than TB that's susceptible to first-line drugs. Explain why drug-resistant TB is so troubling to health officials.
It's troubling for health officials from a variety of perspectives. First of all, people with drug-resistant tuberculosis often do not respond to the drugs and they die. They also are more likely to continue to transmit tuberculosis to other people and the other people develop tuberculosis, and it becomes difficult to choose appropriate treatment regimens that will prevent tuberculosis from killing that individual, but also spreading tuberculosis, that is drug-resistant tuberculosis, in the community.
I understand that extensively drug-resistant TB is of particular concern and that it seems to be more common in South Africa than in other places. Why is that?
Well, I think one has to recognize that since the 1990s, we have known that people who are infected with HIV, the AIDS virus, are more susceptible to tuberculosis. There is a lot of HIV infection in South Africa, as there is in many other countries of the world. And this outbreak in South Africa, a large proportion of those who had drug-resistant tuberculosis also were infected with the AIDS virus. Consequently, they had very poor outcomes, a very high death rate in that group that was HIV infected with drug-resistant tuberculosis. They died because they were not on appropriate therapy for their tuberculosis, and because they weren't on appropriate therapy for the HIV infection.
The authors note that the large number of cases occurred despite there being a well-functioning TB control plan there. How can something like that happen?
The authors, I think, do an excellent job of pointing out several of the factors that may have contributed to the ongoing outbreak of tuberculosis in that particular area. First of all, the individuals work in a gold mine, and being in the mine in close quarters is a situation in which tuberculosis is transmitted very easily. In addition, an extremely high proportion of these people share the same living quarters. And thirdly, people who had tuberculosis were put on a common tuberculosis ward. And what that meant was that people with drug-resistant tuberculosis were mixed with people who had tuberculosis that was originally susceptible to the drugs, but then got reinfected, as we say, with the drug-resistant strain. So more attention, as they point out, to isolation precautions, more attention to treating the HIV infection may have helped avert the problem.
Do these findings have any implications for other places trying to control tuberculosis?
They certainly do. In 2006, CDC published in our Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report a survey that was done by CDC and the World Health Organization, which showed that multi-drug resistant tuberculosis and extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis were fairly widespread, especially in less developed countries. And so there are many programs around the world that are facing this problem of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis, combined with HIV infection. And consequently, all countries need to adjust our TB control policies, to treat people appropriately, to develop more rapid methods for doing drug susceptibility testing, and to treating people's HIV infection immediately when we start the treatment of tuberculosis. And through that, I think that we can start to get a handle on this bad situation.
Thanks, Dr. Snyder. I've been talking today with CDC's Dr. Dixie Snyder about a paper that appears in the February 2010 issue of CDC's journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases. You can see the entire article online at www.cdc.gov/EID. If you'd like to comment on this podcast, send an email to eideditor@cdc.gov. That's eideditor, one word, @cdc.gov. I'm Karen Hunter for Emerging Infectious Diseases.
For the most accurate health information, visit www.cdc.gov. or call 1-800-CDC-INFO 24/7. This podcast is presented by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. CDC, safer, healthier people.
Hello, I'm Karen Hunter. With me today is Dr. Oliver Morgan, an epidemiologist at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We're talking about a paper in the April 2010 issue of CDC's journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases. The article looks at the spread of the pandemic influenza strain H1N1 in the spring of 2009 in Texas, specifically whether the flu was spreading between family members in households, and if so, how. Welcome, Dr. Morgan.
Thank you.
This new flu was first identified in April 2009 and by June had spread across the globe. CDC and the Texas Department of Health set out to investigate whether flu was spreading within households. Dr. Morgan, why is it so important to look at household transmission?
Household transmission is a good indicator of infectiousness of influenza. And when we did this investigation at the very beginning of the pandemic in the US, the findings from this investigation, along with others, were used to immediately inform the public health response.
What did you find in Texas?
We included 349 individuals from 77 households. We found that 9% of household members who were exposed to another ill household member with H1N1 flu also developed flu. However, children were more affected than adults. 18% of children under 5 years of age and 11% of 5 to 18-year-olds got the flu, much higher than numbers we saw among the adults in the household. We also found that children were more likely to be the person to introduce the flu into the household than adults.
What are some of the reasons that children may have been more at risk or more likely to spread the disease?
Children tend not to cover their mouths when they cough or wash their hands when they sneeze, and this may mean that they're more likely to spread the flu virus. Children also tend to have close physical contact with their brothers and sisters, as well as parents or caregivers, which may increase the risk of infection. Another possibility is that adults may have greater immunity to the flu virus from previous flu virus infections during their lifetime.
What does this investigation tell us about future pandemics?
Well, this investigation cannot tell us what will happen during future pandemics, because a new flu virus may behave very differently. However, it does confirm that children play an important role in the transmission of influenza viruses, and that reducing infection among children and their caregivers, such as giving them H1N1 vaccine, may help reduce the spread of the disease.
Thanks, Dr. Morgan. I've been talking with CDC's Dr. Oliver Morgan about a paper that appears in the April 2010 issue of CDC's journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases. You can see the entire article online at www.cdc.gov/EID. If you'd like to comment on this podcast, send an email to eideditor@cdc.gov. That's eideditor, one word, @cdc.gov. I'm Karen Hunter for Emerging Infectious Diseases.
For the most accurate health information, visit www.cdc.gov or call 1-800-CDC-INFO 24/7. This podcast is presented by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. CDC, safer, healthier people.
Hello, I'm Karen Hunter. With me today is Stacy Martin, an epidemiologist at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We're talking about a paper in the March 2010 issue of CDC's journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases. The article describes a recent study of trends in Haemophilus influenza disease in Europe. Welcome, Stacy.
Thanks, Karen. I'm happy to be here.
Before we talk specifically about the study, tell me a little bit about Haemophilus influenza.
Sure. Haemophilus influenza are bacteria commonly found in the nose and throat of children and adults. They are differentiated by their protective capsule into 6 different serotypes, identified as A through F. There are also strains that have no capsule, which we commonly refer to as non-typable or non-encapsulated. The bacteria can cause a variety of infections in children and adults, ranging from localized infections of the ear, eye, or sinuses, to more serious and invasive infections like pneumonia, bacteremia, and meningitis.
Pneumococcal disease.
In the United States and Europe, before the introduction of effective childhood vaccines, serotype B, called Hib, was a leading cause of bacterial meningitis in children younger than 5 years of age. Since the introduction of these vaccines, there's been a dramatic decrease in the incidence of Hib disease. The other strains of Haemophilus influenza, particularly the non-typical strains, most often cause non-invasive disease in children and adults with chronic lung disease. However, newborns, immunocompromised persons, and persons with underlying medical conditions are at risk of invasive disease from the non-type B strains.
Isn't vaccination against Hib routine now?
Yes. All children under the age of 5 should be vaccinated. Children in the United States should get either 3 or 4 doses of Hib, depending on which brand their doctor uses. The vaccine is recommended at 2, 4, 6, and 12 through 15 months of age.
Did the study described in the article cover all European countries?
No. It was part of a collaborative European study that was started in 1996 to study the epidemiology of invasive Haemophilus influenza after the introduction of Hib vaccine into national infant immunization programs. In 1998, the program was expanded and named the European Union Invasive Bacterial Infection Surveillance Network. By 2006, a total of 28 countries routinely reported cases to a central database. In the study, the authors used data from 14 participating countries that regularly serotyped all clinical isolates of Haemophilus influenza for the longest period of time, which was from 1996 to 2006.
Did anything in the paper strike you as being particularly interesting or surprising?
Well, I encourage the listeners to read the paper because it contains a lot of interesting findings that we don't have time to summarize now. But the authors found that even though the incidence of invasive non-type B Haemophilus influenza is now higher than Hib and associated with a higher case fatality, there was no substantial increase in invasive non-type B Haemophilus influenza infections. This finding is important because it suggests that near elimination of Hib in Europe hasn't led to substantial disease replacement by non-type B strains of Haemophilus influenza.
Now, this study was done in Europe. Can its findings be applied elsewhere?
Well, yes. These results, as well as data from the United States, provide strong evidence that Hib vaccination programs are effective at minimizing the burden of invasive Hib. Although it is possible that differences in vaccine schedules, types of vaccines used, and the local epidemiology of Haemophilus influenza may impact the findings elsewhere. These unknowns highlight why it's important that countries implement surveillance to better understand the country-specific epidemiology of Haemophilus influenza, especially after the implementation of a Hib vaccination program. This study also highlights that Haemophilus influenza is still an important pathogen and that continued surveillance is needed to assess the long-term effectiveness of Hib vaccination and to quickly detect any changes in the epidemiology of disease. As new vaccines are in development, it's important to know which strains are causing the disease.
Thanks, Stacy. I've been talking with CDC's Stacy Martin about a paper that appears in the March 2010 issue of CDC's journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases. You can see the entire article online at www.cdc.gov/EID. If you'd like to comment on this podcast, send an email to eideditor@cdc.gov. That's eideditor, one word, @cdc.gov. I'm Karen Hunter for Emerging Infectious Diseases.
For the most accurate health information, visit www.cdc.gov or call 1-800-CDC-INFO 24/7. This podcast is presented by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. CDC, safer, healthier people.
Hello, I'm Karen Hunter. With me today is Dr. Stuart Nickel, Chief of the Special Pathogen Branch at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We're talking about a paper in...
Thanks, Karen. It's great to be here.
Dr. Nickel, this article traces an outbreak of Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever in Sudan, the first reported human cases in the country of this highly fatal disease. Tell us a little bit about this disease.
The Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever, or what we refer to as CCHF, is a tick-borne virus, and people become infected either by direct bite from virus-infected ticks or from contact with virus-infected livestock which have been infected by tick bites, or in very resource-poor communities, you'll get what we call nosocomial transmission of the virus to people. Affect the nursing staff and the doctors who are treating these patients and coming in close contact with them.
Why is this disease such a concern for health officials?
Well, it's really a concern because the initial symptoms are fairly nondescript. So it's what we would loosely call sort of flu-like symptoms or febrile illness, where the patients will show up with a high fever, often with chills and headaches and muscle aches and what have you. But then you'll get very rapid progression over the next 3 days or so to a hemorrhagic form of the disease, where you can get hemorrhaging of the blood vessels in the skin, what we call petechiae, or you'll get bleeding from the nose, or you get bloody diarrhea or vomit, and this can rapidly progress to a multi-organ shock and quite frequently death in these cases.
How did this outbreak in Sudan begin, and how did it spread?
Well, as far as we can figure, the initial case was a 60-year-old butcher who had probably acquired the infection from butchering a virus-infected animal and coming in contact with the blood and tissues of that animal. He turned up to the local hospital in this very rural, resource-poor area of Sudan, and quickly we had these chains of human-to-human transmission of the virus as the members of the nursing staff and the doctors became infected, and also family members of the butcher, his sister and other family members became infected as well. It probably spread so quickly among these folks because of the resource-poor nature of the setting, where they really didn't have the means to take adequate precautions to protect themselves, such as using gloves and masks, and what we would consider universal barrier nursing kind of conditions.
In the Sudan outbreak, there were a surprising number of family members infected. Any idea why this was?
I think, as is typical in many resource-poor areas in Africa, that family members get directly involved in the care of the patients. So it's usually expected that a family member will go into a hospital with a severe case like this, and will take care of their general needs, changing them, even sleeping on the same bed with them. So obviously these family members have very close, direct contact with these highly infectious patients. So I think that's the reason why we saw a number of family members involved in this outbreak.
This disease typically kills about 30% of its victims, but in this case, the numbers seem much higher. What could be the reason for this?
Well, our suspicion is actually that probably the case fatality associated with that outbreak isn't as high as it would seem at first glance. Here we had something like, I think, somewhere between 6 to 9 of the cases died out of 10 to 13 cases that were identified, which is extremely high. But often is the case in these very resource-poor settings that it's only really the very severe cases or the deaths that come to the attention of the authorities, and the milder cases will probably go undetected. So our suspicion is that probably the case fatality in this outbreak was probably closer to the more normal 30% kind of level.
These were the first confirmed cases of this disease in Sudan. How did it get there?
Well, again, our suspicion is that it's probably been there a long time. The virus is known to be in a variety of areas throughout Africa. It's also present in southern Europe and over into various areas of Asia, Pakistan and Western China, etc. So the suspicion is that the virus has probably been there a long time, and cases have been going on undiagnosed. If we look at the genetics of the virus strain that we found in Sudan, which is described in the paper, what we can see is that there's actually a genetic link between this strain that's present in Sudan and other strains that we've seen in South Africa and parts of West Africa, Mauritania and Nigeria. So what this is telling us is that this CCHF virus is moving around over fairly broad distances in Africa. How is the virus moving? Probably by livestock movements, movements of camels, larger distance movements, perhaps birds will be virus as well.
Thanks, Dr. Nickel. I've been talking with CDC's Dr. Stuart Nickel about a paper that appears in the May 2010 issue of CDC's journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases. You can see the entire article online at www.cdc.gov/EID. If you'd like to comment on this podcast, send an email to eideditor@cdc.gov. I'm Karen Hunter for Emerging Infectious Diseases.
For the most accurate health information, visit www.cdc.gov or call 1-800-CDC-INFO 24/7. This podcast is presented by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. CDC, safer, healthier people.
Hello, I'm Karen Hunter. With me today is Dr. Brett Peterson, an EIS officer in the rabies program at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We're talking about a paper appearing in the March 2010 issue of CDC's journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases. The article, Terrestrial Rabies and Human Post-Exposure Prophylaxis in New York State, examined rabies trends within the state, but did not include the city of New York. Welcome, Dr. Peterson.
Thanks, Karen. It's great to be here.
Dr. Peterson, the article describes rabies exposure data collected in New York from 1993 through 2002. Now, in the United States, isn't rabies in humans a very rare disease?
Fortunately, yes. Human rabies has become rare in the United States. We really only see a handful of cases each year, and this is thanks to successful animal control and vaccination programs. However, exposure to the rabies virus is not a rare thing, and most of these exposures are from animal bites. So keeping animals healthy helps to protect humans as well. It's also possible to prevent rabies after an exposure occurs by administering rabies vaccine and immunoglobulin. Now this is called post-exposure prophylaxis, or PEP.
How common is rabies PEP in the United States?
Well, we don't really know. We know that thousands of people receive PEP every year, but we don't have an exact number because human exposures to rabies virus and PEP are not nationally notifiable events. Estimates suggest that up to 40,000 people receive PEP each year, but even this might be an underestimate. The study, for example, notes that over 18,000 people receive PEP in the 10 years the study covered. And keep in mind that the study excluded the most populous part of the state, New York City, and it also excluded the people who receive PEP due to exposures to bats, which can be quite common.
Now, what else stands out about this article? Did anything in it surprise you?
Well, it does re-emphasize a number of things that we know already. One is the importance of vaccinating companion animals against rabies. About 2/3 of the potential exposures in the study were from dogs and cats, and even though most of these animals were not rabid, several hundred of them were. Also, over half of the PEP administered in the study were due to exposures from animals that were never captured for observation or testing, and it's likely that increased efforts to capture these animals would make it possible to rule out rabies and thereby decrease unnecessary PEP. One other interesting aspect of the study was the data showing what percentage of patients actually completed the PEP protocol.
What do you mean by that?
Well, in the study, about 10% of the patients did not receive all 5 doses in the rabies vaccination series. And the new recommendations from the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices has actually reduced the number of doses of vaccine from 5 to 4. And we hope this will help make it easier to complete the series. But it's also reassuring that even though not everybody received all 5 doses, nobody got rabies. These updated recommendations can be found from the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly website at www.cdc.gov/MMWR.
Besides the EID article and the ACIP recommendations, where else can listeners find more information on rabies?
Well, CDC's rabies website is a great resource that has information about the disease for both the general public and healthcare professionals. The website is www.cdc.gov/RABIES.
Thanks, Dr. Peterson. I've been talking with CDC's Dr. Brett Peterson about a paper that appears in the March 2010 issue of CDC's journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases. You can see the entire article online at www.cdc.gov/EID. If you'd like to comment on this podcast, send an email to eideditor editor at cdc.gov. That's EID editor, one word, at cdc.gov. I'm Karen Hunter for Emerging Infectious Diseases.
For the most accurate health information, visit www.cdc.gov or call 1-800-CDC-INFO 24/7. This podcast is presented by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. CDC, safer, healthier people.
Hello, I'm Karen Hunter. With me today is Dr. Pierre Rolland, an epidemiologist at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We're talking about a paper in the June 2010 issue of the CDC's journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases. The article looks at 2 outbreaks of the Rift Valley fever virus in Madagascar during 2 rainy seasons in 2008 and 2009. Welcome, Dr. Rolland. Now, Dr. Rolland, let's start by describing Rift Valley fever and how it affects animals and people.
Rift Valley fever is a disease transmitted by mosquito. It's due to a virus and can infect human, giving mostly mild disease, but sometimes very severe and sometimes death in human. And in animals, it can give abortion in pregnant animals, but also death in the euthanasia.
CDC set out to study these 2 outbreaks in 2008 and 2009 in Madagascar. What did you find?
We have a long-term relation with the Institut Pasteur in Madagascar, and they invite us when they discover that there was some human case and animal case of Rift Valley fever in different parts of the country. They received some specimens from animals and humans, and they were able to confirm, to isolate the virus, to confirm the disease in some human animals. Because of this relationship, we ask us to come and to help with the mountain canyon.
Are outbreaks more likely during rainy seasons, and if so, why?
Outbreak could occur anytime, but because it's transmitted by mosquitoes, the rain is very important, helping to have higher, more important mosquito population. So it's always following big rain, heavy rain, unusual rain, where suddenly you have a large population.
Yeah, that's the bike trail. Yeah, like.
What role do slaughterhouses play in the spread of this disease?
Human can be infected by mosquito bite, but most likely by contact with sick animals. And very often when people have sick animals, they bring them to the slaughterhouse to be slaughtered before they die, so they can be consumed. And the people in contact with the meat and with the animal can be infected. So the people in the slaughterhouse are as a sentinel population. If there is some sick animal due to Rift Valley fever, they can concentrate in the slaughterhouse. That's why we chose that population.
You later looked at blood samples from almost 2,000 volunteers. What did that tell you about the spread of disease outside of the outbreaks?
The human disease was reported in only few areas of the big island of Madagascar, and the animal disease was also concentrated in the same place. But when we test all these volunteers from all the districts of the island, we found that in fact the virus or infected animal enter in the slaughterhouse of nearly all the districts of the island. So the virus and the disease was more spread than we thought at the beginning.
What are the implications of this study for future outbreaks of Rift Valley fever in this area?
I think there is big surveillance system, mostly using some remote assessing with satellite and index of vegetation, so you don't have to be in the field to figure out that you have more rain. You can measure that from the vegetation index. And this system is very important because it helps to put the surveillance in place and to predict future outbreak and to be able to respond before the outbreak is too high.
Thanks, Dr. Rolland. I've been talking with CDC's Dr. Pierre Rolland about a paper in the June 2010 issue of CDC's journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases. You can see the entire article online at www.cdc.gov/EID. If you'd like to comment on this podcast, send an email to EIDeditor@cdc.gov. That's
For the most accurate health information, visit www.cdc.gov or call 1-800-CDC-INFO 24/7. This podcast is presented by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. CDC, safer, healthier people.
Hello, I'm Karen Hunter. With me today is Dr. Peter Gerner-Schmidt, a microbiologist at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We're talking about a paper in the June 2010 issue of CDC's journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases. The article looks at the use of pulsed field gel electrophoresis for salmonella surveillance in Houston, Texas. Welcome, Dr. Gerner-Schmidt.
Thank you, Karen. I'm happy to be here.
Dr. Gerner-Schmidt, what is pulsed field gel electrophoresis?
Well, pulsed field gel electrophoresis, or PFG as we call it, is the DNA fingerprinting method that we use to subtype bacteria that cause foodborne illnesses such as salmonella. PFG is an extremely accurate method to determine which specific strain of pathogenic bacteria is associated with an outbreak of disease. And the paper from Texas describes the work done by the Houston Department of Health and Human Services in identifying outbreaks of salmonella infections by linking the results of patient interviews with clusters of PFG patterns for salmonella detected by the local PulseNet laboratory.
That sounds very intriguing. What is PulseNet?
Well, PulseNet is a national network that monitors foodborne bacteria through their DNA fingerprints. It's coordinated by Centers for Disease Control in collaboration with the Association of Public Health Laboratories. PulseNet allows public health officials to determine if a case of a foodborne illness is an isolated event or if more cases occur at the same time, which could indicate that an outbreak is going on. And this can help the epidemiologists to find the source of the infections faster.
I see. Do all the PulseNet labs use PFGE in the same way?
Yes, all PulseNet laboratories do the subtyping the same way. They do that to ensure that all the data submitted will be equally accurate and reliable. And the CDC has developed standardized PFG methods for PulseNet certified labs to use, and all PulseNet labs must participate in that quality assurance scheme of testing every year. Once the labs have obtained PFG patterns, those patterns are uploaded to a national PulseNet database at CDC, and CDC database managers regularly do searches of the national data to look for clusters of identical patterns. And state and county health department personnel also do regular searches of their local PulseNet data and look for clusters. In both cases, search results are reported to CDC and state epidemiologists. And if the listeners would like to know more about the details of PulseNet and how it works, they could go to our website, which is www.cdc.gov/PulseNet.
It sounds like PulseNet is an extremely useful public health tool.
Yes, it is. The Texas study provides a nice example of how PulseNet helps a local health department in Houston. The Texas Department of Health Services and CDC work together to determine if salmonella cases in Houston County were linked to cases elsewhere, either in Texas or nationally. Of course, as this study shows, outbreak investigations also rely on patient interviews. And one of our new developments is in the outbreak investigations to do the patient interviews at the same time as we do PFG, not waiting for the PFG results. The sooner the patients are interviewed after getting sick, the fresher their memories are regarding the possible sources of exposures.
Thanks, Dr. Gerner-Schmidt. I've been talking with CDC's Dr. Peter Gerner-Schmidt about a paper that appears in the June 2010 issue of CDC's journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases. You can see the entire article online at www.cdc.gov/EID. If you'd like to comment on this podcast, send an email to eideditor@cdc.gov. That's eideditor, one word, @cdc.gov. I'm Karen Hunter for Emerging Infectious Diseases.
For the most accurate health information, visit www.cdc.gov or call 1-800-CDC-INFO 24/7.
2010 issue of CDC's journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases. The articles look at illnesses caused by Rickettsia felis in Kenya and rural Senegal. Welcome, Dr. Paddock.
Thank you for inviting me to speak with you.
Dr. Paddock, what is Rickettsia felis and how does it affect people?
Rickettsia felis is a bacterium that is transmitted to humans and animals by several different types of blood-feeding arthropods. These can include fleas, ticks. In the case of Rickettsia felis, primarily it's a very common flea species found on dogs and cats, known as the cat flea. What's interesting about this particular rickettsial disease is that it's been described on nearly every continent around the world, except for Antarctica. It causes a fairly mild illness compared to other rickettsial diseases that most people are familiar with, like rock-and-roll spotted fever or epidemic typhus. In the case of Rickettsia felis infection, most patients just develop a fever, headache, muscle aches, maybe a rash. There have been no known deaths attributable to Rickettsia felis infection. Nonetheless, because it's so broadly distributed, we think that it's probably a very important rickettsial disease.
These two studies looked at Rickettsia felis as a cause of febrile illnesses in patients in Kenya and Senegal. Tell us about the studies.
Well, both were prospective surveillance studies looking at patients who had undifferentiated febrile illnesses. And what they first did in each study was to eliminate malaria as a possible cause of the diseases, because malaria is very, very common in Africa. Once they did this, they used very sensitive and very specific molecular tests to look for rickettsial diseases. And surprisingly, in both of these studies, they found that Rickettsia felis was a fairly common cause of febrile illness. And in both cases, it was anywhere from 4 to 6% of the persons that they looked at over the intervals for each study. I think in the Senegal study, it was 9 months. In the Kenya study, it was 23 months. So this is a fairly high incidence for rickettsial disease. The other surprising thing is that they were looking for multiple causes of rickettsial disease, and with the exception of one other pathogen found in the Senegal study, all of the causes were attributable to this one agent, Rickettsia felis.
In Kenya, all the patients had a history of contact with animals. Knowing this, how can people protect themselves?
Well, that wasn't surprising because all rickettsial diseases are zoonoses, which are diseases of animals that are transmissible to humans. And in the case of Rickettsia felis, the way that they're transmitted to humans is by the cat flea. And the cat flea is associated often with companion animals, pets like dogs and cats, and these animals are much more likely to be in close association with humans as opposed to wild animals. So really, in order to diminish the number of cases of these infections, you want to treat the animals for their ectoparasites, in this case for fleas. This is probably much more achievable in the United States, in an affluent country, than it would be in places like Kenya or Senegal.
The Senegal study concluded that children have a significantly higher rate of developing fever from Rickettsia felis than older people. Why is that, and what are the implications of this finding?
Well, that was a very interesting finding, and there could be several reasons responsible for that. The first is that younger children are often in closer association with these companion animals than older patients. The other possibility is that people develop immunity to Rickettsia felis infection after repeated exposures to the bacterium. I think the caveat here is that this is one small study. You're looking at, I believe it was about 163 patients in the Senegal study. So these are the results of a single study, and they're very compelling, although I think we need to have more studies to determine whether or not this is something that really applies generally to this disease. Also remember that in the study in Kenya, they did not see this
when should somebody seek medical attention?
Well, there are about 15 to 20 different rickettsia species that can cause rickettsial illness, and unfortunately, all of them have very similar signs and symptoms early during the illness, which generally are fever, muscle aches, headache, and often a rash. What's important is to recognize that you've had an exposure to a flea or a tick or a mite that might have transmitted one of these infections, because in the case of some of the other diseases we're talking about, like Rocky Mountain spot fever, the infection can progress very quickly and can potentially kill the patient. In the case of rickettsia felis, the patients may be ill for 1 to 2 weeks and feel terrible, but we don't know of any deaths attributable to this infection. Nonetheless, you really want to be able to treat any suspected rickettsial disease as early as possible. And the drug of choice is doxycycline. It's effective for treating any rickettsial disease.
Thanks, Dr. Paddock. I've been talking with CDC's Dr. Chris Paddock about 2 papers that appear in the July 2010 issue of CDC's journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases. You can see both articles online at www.cdc.gov/EID. If you'd like to comment on this podcast, send an email to eideditor@cdc.gov. I'm Karen Hunter for Emerging Infectious Diseases.
For the most accurate health information, visit www.cdc.gov or call 1-800-CDC-INFO 24/7.
Correct.
This podcast is presented by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. CDC, safer, healthier people.
Hello, I'm Karen Hunter. With me today is Olin Q, Associate Director for Global Laboratory Science at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We're talking about a paper in the July 2010 issue of CDC's journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases. The article looks at vaccine-associated paralytic poliomyelitis, or VAP, in immune-deficient children in Iran. Welcome, Olin.
Thanks, Karen. It's great to be here. VAP is an important issue in the global eradication of polio. VAP is an infection caused by exposure to the live virus polio vaccine, which is given orally. It's a very rare event, but still happens often enough to be a public health concern. Back when the oral vaccine was used in the United States, before 2000, there would be about 8 cases per year, and about 20% of those would be in persons who had primary immune deficiencies. That is, they had defects in antibody production. Iran has a much smaller population than the U.S., so the number of cases there is less than 1 per year. If a person is known to have an immune deficiency, that person may not be given a live virus vaccine. But in Iran, the first dose of polio vaccine is given at birth. That's why most of the cases reported in this paper occurred in very young infants. Their immune deficiencies weren't then known. The author suggested
someone did become ill with VAP, how would the illness be transmitted from person to person?
Polio is an enteric infection, so the usual transmission route is fecal-oral. A person eats or drinks something that has been contaminated with the virus. In addition to vaccination, improving sanitation and personal hygiene to reduce exposure to contamination is an important part of the global polio eradication efforts.
Thanks, Olin. I've been talking with CDC's Dr. Olin Q about a paper that appears in the July 2010 issue of CDC's journal Emerging Infectious Diseases. You can see the entire article online at www.cdc.gov/EID. If you'd like to comment on this podcast, send an email to eideditor@cdc.gov. That's eideditor, one word, @cdc.gov. I'm Karen Hunter for Emerging Infectious Diseases.
For the most accurate health information, visit www.cdc.gov or call 1-800-CDC-INFO 24/7.
Last podcast. Almost there. Finally, maybe I have an hour. Lucky. Just picking up the mountain and down the mountain. That's all I have time for. I really would have liked to have hiked on the trail. I guess this must be it. It's a popular exercise area. Where are they though? I don't see steps. That's a game. That's a deer. It should be here. Oh my gosh, that's it. That's 1,000 steps. They're made out of wood. Crap. I didn't think they would be made out of wood. Completely illegal U-turn. Sorry, PAPD. Don't want to miss this. There's not much time left in the day. We just had the daylight savings, so any other day there probably wouldn't be any parking here anyway. State Gangland's 112. Don't come here on a Saturday, that's for